A city shrugs at history, pours concrete strength into brick and marble, and then pretends the laws of physics are more like suggestions. Constantinople does this in 537, with a dome so audacious that an emperor walks in and declares victory over Solomon. The dome still stands. The empire falls in 1453. The dome does not care. The scene is Constantinople under Justinian I, the kind of emperor who treats building like an Olympic sport. After the Nika riot of 532 tears through the city and torches swathes of it, the hippodrome bleachers overflowing, tens of thousands dead, he decides reconstruction won't be subtle. The solution is Hagia Sophia, finished in record time. Between 532 and 537, designed by Anthemius of Traios and Isidorus of Miletus. Mathematician engineers who approach architecture like a geometry proof that also serves incense. This church aims at spectacle with engineering. The main dome spans about 31 meters across and rises roughly 55.6 meters above the floor. Peering down through a ring of 40 windows that make the base of the dome look as if it's floating on light. Pendentives, the curved triangular elements that carry the circular dome onto a square of piers, do the muscle work. The Byzantines don't invent the concept of the pendentive from scratch, but they scale it into a city-sized statement. Procopius, the court historian, stares up and writes about light pouring in and the vault seeming to hang from heaven. Modern engineers stare up and produce load diagrams. The dome doesn't just rest on 4 piers and good intentions. It sits over a system of half-domes and quarter-domes, cascading outward like structural shock absorbers. The mortar is a pozzolanic brew, in other words, a Roman recipe with volcanic ash or crushed brick that sets underwater, stays flexible, and refuses to crack just because the ground throws a tantrum. The bricks are relatively light. The masonry binds with iron clamps, set in lead, which adds a tiny bit of play. This structure tells earthquakes that wobbling is fine, collapsing is not. Then, in 558, gravity and vibration file a complaint anyway. An earthquake knocks the original dome down. By 562, Isidorus the Younger, nephew of one of the original architects, rebuilds it steeper and stronger. He adds about 6 meters of height in the dome's profile, thickens certain arches, and refines support lines to shove lateral thrust into the buttresses and half domes. Later quakes in 900 and Madi 9 and 1346 crack things again. An Armenian master builder from Arni named Tredat Tiridates repairs in the 1990s with an engineer's flair for pointed arches and stressed ribs. The dome keeps returning for encores. The building survives crusaders, earthquakes, and regime changes. The Ottomans add minarets and still treat the structure like the gold standard, which is proper behavior around a 6th century building that outperforms most of the modern skyline. Those interiors explain the medieval crush on the place. Gold-ground mosaics line the vaults. Each tessera is tilted a degree or two, so candlelight hits it like a million tiny disco balls. Paul the Salentary describes the reconsecration of 562 with poetry. Modern acousticians measure reverberation times around 10 to 11 seconds and nod like sound engineers at a stadium. The marble revetments are book-matched paneling, sliced stone mirrored left and right, so the walls look like a geological Rorschach test. Proconnesian marble from the island of Marmara streaks in grey. Thessalian green pops. Egyptian porphyry columns flex imperial purple. Spolia, columns and capitals, scavenged from older monuments, turn the Roman past into the Byzantine present. The effect is a curated museum that also handles Christmas liturgy and imperial coronations. A quick myth audit handles a few favorites. Myth 1: Byzantine architecture equals Hagia Sophia and a long nap. The nap narrative dies immediately. The empire keeps building for a millennium, and it loves variety. Cisterns the size of football fields, walls that eat sieges for breakfast, monastic campuses with hospitals, palaces with robot lions. Myth 2: pendentives were a Byzantine patent. The truth is messier and more interesting. Experiments with squinches and transitional vaults show up around Persia and Armenia. The Byzantines go all in and industrialize the pendentive at urban scale, then use it in wave after wave of domed churches. Myth 3: Byzantium only builds churches. The water supply alone disproves that. Water means life, and Constantinople plans like a city that expects sieges. The aqueduct of Valens spans a valley near today's Fatih district, completed around 368, 373 under Emperor Valens. The visible stretch that still marches across the city is about 971 meters long, but the larger water network eventually runs for over 250 kilometers, threading Thracian hills with channels, bridges, and inverted siphons. It pulls water from reservoirs and lakes outside the city and feeds fountains, baths, palaces, and an underground world of cisterns. The Basilica cistern sits under a nondescript plaza, a short walk from Hagia Sophia. This underground reservoir measures about 138 meters by 64.6 meters, with a roof supported by 336 columns, arranged in 12 rows of 28. Ceiling height hits roughly 9 meters, and total capacity hovers around 80,000 cubic meters. The walls are waterproofed with thick mortar. The columns come from everywhere, spolia from older Roman and Greek buildings. So capitals mix Ionic scrolls and leafy Corinthian. 2 column bases reuse Medusa, heads set sideways and upside down. Engineers say those blocks were convenient, and the orientation spreads load evenly. Tourists say the effect is spooky and Instagram friendly. Both are true. Cisterns like Bin Berdierek, the cistern of Philoxenos, with its 224 columns and brick-built above-ground walls, hold even more water. Open-air giants like the Aetius cistern, about 244 by 85 meters and around 15 meters deep, store rainwater and look like sports arenas. This network lets the city outlast sieges, fill baths, and keep palace gardens green. A city that hides lakes underfoot isn't improvising. It's doing long-term logistics with brick vaults. Defense architecture in this empire treats foreign policy like masonry. The Theodosian walls, built between 408 and 413 under the regency of Anthemius for Theodosius II, stitch 5.7 kilometers across the land approach to Constantinople. A triple line forms a nightmare for invaders: a ditch, an outer wall with its own towers, an inner wall roughly 12 meters high and about 5 meters thick, backed by massive towers, 96 along the inner circuit, placed at regular intervals. Brick bands in the stonework act like seismic seatbelts. A major earthquake in 447 tears the walls. The city repairs them in a frenzy, reportedly in about 60 days, and then shrugs at Attila the Hun. Over the next millennium, the walls resist Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Crusaders. They finally fall to gunpowder and relentless artillery in 1453, when massive bombards batter sections with stone balls weighing up to 300 kilograms. The walls lose to technology that did not exist when they were built. This counts as aging with dignity. The city's showpiece for spectacle lives next to the palace. The Hippodrome, originally laid out under Septimius Severus and expanded under Constantine. The track runs roughly 450 meters long and about 130 meters wide, with seats for tens of thousands, estimates land somewhere between 30,000 and a normal day, crammed tight during major races. The spina, the central barrier, shows off monuments, looted or commissioned from all over. The obelisk of Thutmose III, carved in Egypt in the 15th century B and shipped to Constantinople in 390 under Theodosius I, stands on a pedestal carved with reliefs of the emperor presiding over the games. The bronze serpent column from Delphi curls nearby, hauled to the city in the early years after 330 as imperial bling. Racing factions shout. Politics bleeds into sport. The Nika riot of 532 turns the Hippodrome into a battlefield. Architecture in Constantinople is never just walls and vaults. It's a stage. The Great Palace fills the ridge between the Hippodrome and the sea, with courtyards, halls, and pavilions that spool together across centuries. Constantine's original core grows under Justinian, then under the Macedonian dynasty and again under the Komnenoi. The Chrysotriclinos, built under Justin II in the late 6th century and refurbished later, becomes the gilded heart of court ritual. Liutprand of Cremona visits in 949 and records the weird, glorious details. Bronze lions that roar, golden birds singing in artificial trees, a throne that rises. Scholars connect these automata to court engineers like the 9th century polymath Leo the mathematician. A palace that deploys hydraulics and pneumatics to troll ambassadors is fully committed to theatre. Mosaic floors survive from the Great Palace, discovered in the 1930s. Hundreds of square meters depict hunting scenes, exotic animals, and village vignettes. Not everything is survival of the prettiest. Most of the palace dissolves into later housing. The Bucolian Palace's seaside facade drops onto the Marmara waves in photos from the 19th century. The surviving Tekfur usually called the Palace of the Porphyrogenitus, dates to the late 13th or early 14th century and shows layered brick and stone in recessed courses. An elegant brick and stone polychromy that shouts Paleologan taste and late Byzantine swagger. Church building doesn't stop with Hagia Sophia. Justinian drops Hagia Irene nearby, rebuilt after 532 with a domed basilica plan. Holy Apostles, later destroyed and replaced by the Fatih Mosque, rises on a cruciform plan with 5 domes, acting both as imperial mausoleum and architectural influencer. That church inspires the 5-domed plan of St. Mark's in Venice centuries later because Venetian doges love a good copy with extra glitter. By the 9th century, another typology takes the spotlight. The Cross-in-Square Church. Basil I builds the Nia Ecclesia around 880 in the Palace complex, a 5-domed church described in the sources and lost to time, except in its influence. The plan becomes the standard. A cuby shell, 9 bays, the central bay crowned by a dome on 4 supports, side bays covered with vaults, galleries or ambulatory lines wrapping the core. This format is the empire's signature for the Middle Byzantine period. The style rolls through Greece with refinement. At Hosios Lukas in Boeotia, the monastery complex merges an older 10th century Theotokos church with an 11th century Catholicon. The Catholicon uses an octagonal domed core wrapped by galleries, giving the central space an updraft of light. Daphne, near Athens, rebuilds its church around the late 11th century with a prominent Pantocrator. the Christ in majesty, staring down from the dome. Neomonion Chios, built around 1040 to 1055, under the emperors Constantine X Monomachos. And Zoe uses an insular octagon plan with hidden supports, tricking the eye into a floating dome effect. At all three sites, shimmering gold mosaics tell theology in high-resolution glass. The surfaces are measured, refined, and expensive. By the middle of the 11th century, Byzantium treats glass tesserae like Hollywood treats CGI. Exterior aesthetics in the Middle Byzantine period trend toward bricklace minimalism. Cloisonneau masonry frame stone blocks with brick courses like a jewelry setting. Recessed brick bands, often alternating with stone, create a striped facade. Sawtooth patterns, chevrons, and pseudo-Kufic decorative courses pop up as playful rhythm. Constantinople's own 11th and 12th century buildings, like the monastery complex known today as Arek Mosque, originally the Pantocrator Monastery, mix brick patterns with layered spaces. The Pantocrator complex, built between 1118 and 1130, 6 under John the Tui Komnenos and Empress Irene, becomes a three-church ensemble and a civic machine. Its typicon, the Foundation Charter, lists a hospital with 5 wards, staffed with physicians, surgeons, pharmacists and nurses, at least 50 beds, and a wing for women staffed by female practitioners. Architecture here is logistics. Corridors for care, wards for specific illnesses, kitchens, pharmacies, and a mortuary chapel. The hospital's operations read like a professional manual. 9th century medical training runs through this space. 12th century care runs daily. A world that can run a functional hospital complex also knows how to place windows so light lands where doctors need it. Things get lavish and introspective as the Paleologan period arrives in the 13th and 14th centuries. After the trauma of the Fourth Crusade in 1204 splinters the empire and converts parts of Constantinople into a Latin soap opera. When the Byzantines return in 1261, money is tight, but taste is sharp. Their architecture becomes lighter, more layered, more decorative, like a once wealthy family, learning the power of good tailoring. The Chora Monastery's church, known as the Carrier, becomes the exemplar. Theodore Metochites, a scholar, statesman with a genius for finance and forehead-wrapping hats, renovates the complex around 1315 to 1321, adding a funerary chapel, the Paraclesion, and decorating the interiors with mosaics and frescoes that land somewhere between theological treatise and cinematic montage. The Anastasis fresco shows Christ pulling Adam and Eve from their tombs with kinetic force and glowing whites that seem to radiate off the lime plaster. The mosaics of the inner narthex spin out the genealogy of the Virgin in small medallions that turn walls into pages. Structurally, the Chora church multiplies small domes and barrel vaults. Visually, it multiplies time itself. Conservation historians like Robert Osterhout have traced the layers and phases. The result reads like an architectural palimpsest. Elsewhere, Mount Athos rises on a rocky peninsula in the Aegean, where monasteries grow fortifications the way other buildings grow flower boxes. The Great Lavra, founded in 963 by Athanasius, with backing from Nikephoros Phocasax, anchors a monastic republic with walls, towers, refectories, libraries, and a Catholic home, a main church, refined over centuries. Cross-in square forms here sprout side chapels like branches. The plan expanded into a liturgical station map. Monastic life needs water, bread, books, and quiet. Architecture supplies all four with cisterns, bakeries, scriptoriums, and tight cloisters. Athos becomes a capsule of Byzantine building practices, preserved into the modern era. The empire's architecture isn't shy about exporting ideas. Ravenna, taken by Justinian's forces in the 6th century, spins up San Vitale, consecrated in 547, with an octagonal plan and a dome that rests on curved squinches and arcades. The mosaics of Justinian and Theodora. Flanking the apse are political billboards in glass, purple robes, golden vessels, a bishop stepping forward with a jeweled cross. The building reads as a Western outpost of Constantinopolitan aesthetic. A century later, Charlemagne's Palatine Chapel at Aachen channels Ravenna, which channels Constantinople, creating a long-distance dialogue of arches, domes, and imperial ego. Venice watches Constantinople, like a magpie watches a jewelry box. Mark's Basilica rises in its present form between 1063 and 1094 with 5 domes and a cross plan edged with ambulatory spaces. Its facades drip in marble revetments and spolia, columns, capitals, and slabs taken from various pasts, many shipped after the sack of 1204. The 4 bronze horses above the main entrance come straight from Constantinople's hippodrome trophies. Venetian architects and craftsmen learned to set glass tesserae with the same shimmering tilt, dragonskin patterns of gold flickering under lagoon light. In the east, Kievan Rus converts to Christianity in 1988, and suddenly the Dnieper River carries brick, mortar, and icon painters. Saint Sophia in Kiev, begun around 1037 under Yaroslav the Wise, borrows the idea of a domed basilica and turns up the domes. 13 cupolas now crown the complex. Greek architects likely lead the project. Local materials and techniques translate the language of the capital into Slavic dialect. Frescoes and mosaics survive in patches. Sacred geometry meeting local scale. Sicily under Norman rulers doubles down on hybrid style. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, consecrated in 1140s under Roger II, merges a Latin basilica plan with a Byzantine dome over the crossing. The walls glitter with Greek mosaics, while a Mukana's wooden ceiling adds Islamic geometry. Monreale Cathedral, outside Palermo, finished around 1180 to 1189, repeats the message at larger scale. The stonework and mosaic teams include Greek craftsmen. The program reads like an illustrated theology textbook, drenched in gold. Norman kings import the imperial vibe with a local twist, and Byzantine architecture becomes a multilingual fashion. Back in Constantinople, engineering continues to solve problems that show up every few months. Earthquakes keep the city honest. Builders use brick bands to dissipate shear, embed metal tie rods where possible, and design buttresses that look like emphatic punctuation. Seismic retrofitting, before retrofitting becomes a word. The brick patterns are not decoration alone. The slight compressibility of bricks compared to stone, combined with elastic mortar, turns walls into layered shock absorbers. The city also cares about crowds, heat, and street planning. The Mies, the main avenue crossing the city from the Milion, near Hagia Sophia, to the Forum of Theodosius, and beyond, threads together fora and columns like beads. The Column of Constantine, erected in 330 with porphyry drums, and once capped with a statue of the emperor as a solar god, still stands, scarred by fire in 1779 and clamped with iron hoops, but upright as semblitash. The Milion acts as the 0-mile marker, from which distances across the empire are measured. Urban planning interacts with monuments and processions, not just traffic. The sea defences do their part too. Walls along the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara keep admirals honest. A giant iron chain stretches across the mouth of the Golden Horn from at least the early 7th century. In 1453, Mehmed D famously bypasses it by dragging ships over greased logs on land. An empire famous for naval logistics meets a 15th century lesson in lateral thinking. Even here, architecture frames the drama. The chain anchors on towers, the harbour hemmed by sea walls built in courses of stone that still show up in Istanbul's fabric. Now, headlines love Hagia Sophia as the best in show, but the empire is full of other heavy hitters, hiding under modern names. The Rotunda in Thessaloniki starts life around 306 as a Roman mausoleum or temple under Galerius. It becomes a church in the 4th or 5th century with a 24.5-meter dome, then a mosque under the Ottomans, and now a museum. Inside, shimmering mosaics of saints in architectural frames float high above. Thessaloniki's own Hagia Sophia, a 7th-8th century domed basilica, carries the capital's structural DNA into provincial grace. In the Sinai desert, St. Catherine's Monastery goes up under Justinian around 548-565, with a granite-walled fortification around a basilica and later domed adjustments. A miraculous thorn bush and a library of manuscripts share space with fortified stone. The wall thickness hits 2 meters in places. The complex endures tribal raids, imperial politics, and the slow burn of time because its masonry is simply stubborn. Inside, a 6th century encaustic icon of Christ Pantocrator stares out with asymmetrical eyes that launch 1,000 art history dissertations. Most outsiders experience Byzantine theology through mosaics, but the architecture delivers the punch. Cross-in square plans choreograph movement. The central dome acts as a cosmic canopy. Smaller domes and vaults, attached chapels and galleries, create a rhythm of closeness and release. The templon, an early medieval marble screen, evolves into the iconostasis, a wall of icons that turns the altar area into sacred backstage. Liturgical processions move through spaces sized for drama, not for pews. Architects of the 10th-12th centuries understand sightlines, figure placement, and acoustics with the precision of theatre designers. Materials keep telling the story. Marble revetments arrive, pre-patterned from quarries with distinctive swirls. Proconnesian and Thessalian supply lines explain colour choices. Brick patterns in Constantinople during the 11th-12th centuries include recessed courses that produce a shadow line, a cheap effect with high impact. Mortars include brick dust that adds hydraulic properties. Capitals morph from classical orders into basket weave fantasies and intricate impost blocks, spreading load and providing surface for paint. Doors and windows get framed with molded bricks that handle curves with economy. Byzantine architecture knows when to go maximalist and when to go minimal. A crisp point of pride. The empire never treats engineering like a separate universe from art. The best example remains Hagia Sophia's dome and its illusion of weightlessness. The ring of 40 windows reduces the drum's mass, cuts down on thrust, and lets light pour in. It also convinces the spectator that the dome floats, a sensory effect backed by structural logic. Structural analysis by scholars like Roland Mainstone maps thrust lines and confirms what medieval observers intuited. Science and style shake hands. Another myth squeaks for attention and gets promptly escorted out. The idea that Byzantium stagnated after the age of Justinian doesn't survive contact with the later centuries' innovations. The Paleologon, Renaissance, brings complex brick patterns, figural fresco cycles with depth and psychology, and subtle masonry that balances weight and plasticity. The 13th and 14th century restorations of Hagia Sophia show active structural literacy. The late period palaces like the Porphyrogenitus use alternating belts of brick and stone, with rhythmic windows that anticipate European Gothic light in brick. There is no nap. There is adaptation. Constantinople also delivers public utility with style. Bath culture slows down compared to the Roman high point. But baths, like Zeuxippos, rebuilt by Justinian, still anchor neighborhoods. Fountains called Sibyl and distribution points channel water into daily routines. The city hall, strategion, forums, and markets line up along the Mies with bronze statues that wind up recycled or melted down after 1204. Guilds of builders, sculptors, and mosaicists organized their trades under the rules compiled in the Book of the Eparch around the 10th century. Builders operate in a regulated economy with price controls and standards, not a free-for-all. There is bureaucracy in the mortar. Then comes 1204, the year Crusaders turn their attention span from Jerusalem to Byzantium and conduct a live-fire stress test on an imperial city. The sea walls along the Golden Horn are the weak point. Tall Venetian ships throw boarding bridges. Towers get taken. Churches and palaces get looted. Manuscripts and icons head west. Bronze statues hit melting furnaces. The architectural loss is traumatic and quantifiable. The Holy Apostles goes into decline in the Latin period. Some palaces become barracks. Some churches get Latin altar arrangements. Yet the city survives, and that resilience becomes part of the architecture story. Venice displays the loot and the lessons. The 4 horses on St. Mark's balcony trot into Renaissance history, then get removed by Napoleon in 1797, then returned. Marble revetments from Constantinople find their way into Venetian facades. Romanesque, Gothic, and Byzantine blend on the lagoon, proving that architectural styles travel best in crates. In 1261, the Byzantines retake the city under Michael Violios, and reconstruction needs to be affordable and symbolic. The Blackenay Palace becomes the main residence. The Great Palace by the Hippodrome falls out of use. Churches get patched. New smaller ones get built with refined brickwork. The Paleologan painters and mosaicists decorate interiors with saints that look like they have interior monologues. Light weighs more than volume. Pattern weighs more than mass. This isn't decline. It's late style. A glance at numbers keeps things grounded. Hagia Sophia's footprint covers roughly 3 American basketball courts. The main dome's diameter, at about 31 meters, matches the Selimiye Mosque in Edion, built by the Ottoman master Sinan between 1568 and 1575. Sinan studies the Byzantine exemplar, then supersizes ambition with a dome that hits about 31.3 meters in diameter and soars over a prayer hall that feels like a single breath. The Ottoman skyline, Suleymaniye, converses with Byzantine Constantinople across centuries. Architecture speaks in domes. Empires answer in engineering. Back on the ground, the empire's fortifications get a wider angle. The long wall of Anastasius, an earlier 5th to 6th century line about 56 kilometers west of the city, hints at deep buffer strategies. Fortified passes, garrison towns, and chain of castle systems dot the Anatolian interior. The city's land walls are only the final boss. The entire region reads as an engineered landscape. Archaeological surveys show towers, roads, and bridges coordinated to keep supply moving and raiders guessing. The engineering of domes and vaults schools Europe by osmosis. Pendentives find their way into Western churches. Squinches continue to do the job in Armenian and Persian architectures in parallel. Gothic cathedrals use ribbed vaults and flying buttresses to solve the same problem. How to open interior space to light without controlling earthquakes, the way Rome and Constantinople did. The medieval Mediterranean becomes a conversation about how to set a roof over an audience without burying them. In masonry, Byzantium's answer is calculated curvature and the showman's eye for light. Nothing in this story works without specialists. Antique writers drop names like Anthemius and Isidorus at the top. Later centuries have masters whose names show up only in passing. Try, dear, the Armenian gets a headline for Hagia Sophia's 990s repairs. Teams of anonymous bricklayers, mosaicists, and marble workers turn imperial budgets into glittering theology. The Roman guild world evolves into medieval ateliers and family shops. Contracts survive in bits. Donors' portraits survive in mosaics and frescoes. Theodore Metachites kneels in front of Christ in the Cora Narthex mosaic, with the model of the church in his hands. The message is unambiguous: patronage bill. Abrupt gear shift to the city's underbelly again, because the cistern story gets better with scale. The Aetius cistern, now the location of a football stadium in Istanbul's Fatih district, measures roughly 244 by 85 meters and could store around 250,000 cubic meters of water. The cistern of Asbar, about 152 by 152 meters, adds another vast tank to the grid. These open-air reservoirs collect rainwater and tie into the aqueduct network for distribution. Meanwhile, dozens of smaller covered cisterns pepper hillsides and courtyards. This system means that even when aqueducts are cut, by siege or earthquake neighborhoods survive on reserve. The mathematics of siege-proofing read like a civil engineering syllabus. Ventilation and lighting in underground cisterns pose practical puzzles. Openings are small, columns stand dense, and algae happens. Maintenance workers access narrow platforms. Sediment gets dredged. Water clarity is improved with ceramic pipes settling. The Byzantines don't build underground cathedrals. They build water factories. The aesthetics of flickering torchlight on wet brick are an accidental bonus. The Hippodrome's afterlife is instructive too. After 1204, much of the statuary disappears. After 1453, the Ottomans used the space for ceremonies and events, maintaining it as a long, open field. The serpent column snake heads get knocked off at some point in the 18th century, according to travelers' notes. The obelisk stays, perched on its 390-era base, showing imperial crowds, which means the space has been doing crowd control for over 1,600 years. The marble seats vanish into lime kilns, but the footprint bulldozes its way through history. This empire also weaponizes thresholds. The Golden Gate at the southern end of the land walls, built under Theodosius I and II in the late 4th to early 5th century, is a marble-clad triumphal arch within a defensive wall. Used for imperial entries after victorious campaigns, it eventually gets locked down, integrated into a citadel. The message doesn't change. Architecture says, who gets to process in, and in what order? Nobody wanders in on vibes alone. Materials and methods follow trade routes. Proconnesian marble travels from the Marmara quarries. Green Thessalian marble from the quarries at Charistos. Porphyry from quarries in Egypt. Serpentine and other stones from across the Aegean. Brick kilns produce standardized sizes to match mortar joints. Sculptors cut capitals that transition from classical acanthus to pseudo-Kufic filigree. Craftsmen play with depth under budget constraints. Deep relief is time-consuming. Shallow carving plus paint does the job with less cost. Byzantine exteriors often look restrained. because the budget lives inside. By contrast, many Western Romanesque facades throw sculpture forward because the outer wall is where crowds see, and interiors get darker. Different urban conditions yield different display strategies. A recurring theme appears. Byzantine architecture loves optical tricks that happen to be structural logic. The stepped profile of buttresses looks like decorative staging but channels forces into the ground. The half-domes at Hagia Sophia read like decorative exclamation points. They are lateral thrust accountants. The cross in square churches stack volumes to make intimate spaces feel expansive. At Neomone, the insular octagon collapses, 8 supports into visual invisibility. The dome seems to hang unsupported because the galleries hide the real workhorses. This is not deception. It is theatre that respects physics. Archaeology and scholarship keep this story honest. Procopius's On Buildings provides imperial propaganda wrapped in detail. Paul the Silentiary's description of Hagia Sophia's reconsecration reads like ambient architecture writing from 562. Luprand confirms the palace's animatronic sense of humor. Conservation reports from UNESCO flag sites like Daphne, Hosios Lucas, Neomone and Mount Athos for their World Heritage status. Engineers such as Roland Mainstone and art historians like Cyril Mango and Robert Osterhout map structure and decoration. Acousticians Becerra Pencheva and Jonathan Abel analyze Hagia Sophia's soundscape and reconstruct chants that would have once echoed, proving that marble and mortar also curate hearing. There is one more angle that refuses to be stamped out. The empire's architecture ends up saving itself by changing faiths. After 1453, the Ottomans convert many churches into mosques. Hagia Sophia, Zeyrek, the Korah for periods, Pamacharistos, Phthia. Islamic practice covers figural mosaics with plaster, which can serve as them accidentally. Buttresses go up around Hagia Sophia. Minarets rise. Mirats get installed. Sunan tests himself against Hagia Sophia with the Suleymaniye, finished 1557, and then announces his thesis with the Selimiye in Edion, completed 1575. A mosque whose 31.3-meter dome and 8-pier support system calibrate thrust so cleanly it looks effortless. Ottoman engineering masters a similar language with a different grammar. The across-centuries conversation continues under new management. Meanwhile, on the Greek mainland, Mystrus grows after 1262 as the capital of the despotate of the Morea. The Church of the Pantanassa, consecrated in 1428, drapes frescoes over a layered plan. The Peribleptos carves a rock-hugging church whose frescoes run through a late Byzantine colour palette that still hums. The town clings to a steep spur with a Frankish castle atop and Byzantine churches climbing below, the whole site narrating cultural change in layered stone. Architecture here doesn't do isolated monuments. It does ensembles. Byzantine planning also builds for processions, annual cycles of feasts, imperial entries, relic translations. The Mise becomes a performance avenue. Forums set up stages. When relics move, banners fly, and church doors open into urban ritual. Architecture times itself to liturgy. The location of certain churches near palace gates or in new neighborhoods is as strategic as the placement of a Starbucks near a train station. Underneath the pageantry in stone, the empire's builders fight fire with knowledge. Brick arches over doorways, and windows control crack propagation. Timber tie beams in roofs add elasticity. Timber floors reduce the risk of total collapse in earthquakes. Builders sometimes embed amphorae in domes and vaults as lightweight fillers and acoustic resonators, especially in Western contexts influenced by Roman practice. Byzantine sites show evidence of similar strategies, though not uniformly. Practical empiricism wins. If it made a vault lighter and a hymn clearer, it stayed. Everything interlocks. Religion, engineering, politics, logistics, so clearly that one can pick up any thread and find a building attached to it. Charity in the empire gets an address with a floor plan. Power gets a processional gate. Water security gets brick vaults. Theology gets a luminous dome. No wonder the myths keep trailing the real thing, trying to catch up. The empire's architecture pulls off the trick of being both granite hard and light on its feet, depending on where one looks. Now a quick detour back to the Theodosian walls, because their greatest hits album deserves another track. The walls were not just tall stone lines. They were a system, a moat about 20 meters wide and several meters deep, a low outer wall behind the moat with its own towers, a terrace, a higher outer wall, a second terrace, then the main inner wall with its tall towers. The towers stand about every 50 to 70 meters. The brick bands tie the masonry together across layers. Scarped surfaces make laddering hard. In the 10th century, manuals on siegecraft discuss the walls like a calculus exam. For centuries, battering rams, siege towers, and undermining operations fail. Gunpowder changes the math. The walls fall only when technology shifts the equation, and when the defense experiences logistical strain along the Golden Horn side. The deeper truth behind all of this spectacle is that Byzantine architecture isn't just style, it's a system of thinking. It treats a dome as a thesis, a cistern as a policy, a wall as a geopolitical statement. A palace privileges performance, but tucks in machine rooms with gears and bellows. A hospital puts bed counts and pharmacy windows into a spiritual economy. The medieval East Mediterranean isn't on pause. It's running a software update every century, just in brick and mortar. Some architects in later centuries act like they blissfully discovered everything anew. Their domes hum the old tune. Michelangelo stares at the Pantheon. And St. Peter's Brunelleschi stares at the Florence Baptistery and dome mathematics. Sinan stares straight at Hagia Sophia and says, "Game on," with a very Seljuk grin. The lineage isn't a straight line, but it's visible. Byzantium sits in the middle of it like a quiet producer whose name rolls in the credits while everyone hums the soundtrack. Another feature worth spotlighting: thresholds between sacred and imperial in urban form. The Augustan Square, framed by Hagia Sophia, the Senate House, the Milion, and the Chalke Gate of the palace, acts as a hinge between empire and eternity. Columns rise, bronze statues glitter, processions pass from palace to church. The Chalke's bronze doors, melted down by crusaders, mark the entry into the palace. The near ecclesia sits within the palace grounds. The holy apostles at the other end of the Mise houses imperial tombs. Architecture ties divine sanction to imperial presence with literal corridors and gates. The technique behind setting mosaics deserves a profile. Tesserae split into cubes and rectangles colored with metallic oxides and glass layers, sometimes containing a gold leaf sandwiched between two thin glass sheets. The artisan sets each tiny tile at a slightly different angle so light hits unevenly, producing shimmer and depth. Curved surfaces amplify it. Mosaics weren't wallpaper. They were optical devices. As the light changes across the day, from eastern morning through southern noon to western afternoon, the building redraws its own illustrations. The dome of Daphne's Pantocrator looks calm in morning. By late afternoon, his brows deepen under angled light. Lighting design comes standard with 11th century glass. The empire doesn't shy away from practical ingenuity either. Churches like the Pantocrator and the Chora integrate crypts and burial chapels behind structural logic. The Paraclesion at the Chora uses space efficiently. Barrel vaults sit over colonnades. Small domes mark programmatic zones. Niches for arcosolia house burials under painted cycles of the Anastasis and Last Judgment. Architecture here isn't just about upward soaring. It's about sideways layering. The living and the dead share a plan. In Macedonia and Serbia, the story spins onward. The 14th century church of Gračanica near Pristina repeats the five-dome cross in square in brick bands and stone. The church of Saintos, the church of Saint Panteleimon at Nerezi, 1164, features frescoes with almost shocking emotional realism. The lamentation shows grief in gesture and colour that would fit in a Renaissance chapel, and the architecture sets up that intimacy by keeping spaces compact and acoustically generous. The Byzantine cultural zone flexes beyond imperial borders, and its architecture adapts to new patrons and terrain. Pulling the focus back to the capital one last time, the city's skyline plot twist goes like this. In 1453, after 2 months of siege with bombards and earthworks, Mehmed II enters through the gate near the Blachane quarter. Hagia Sophia, 916 years old that day, becomes a mosque by decree. The building then spends another half-millennium as the core of a different ritual life. In the 1840s, the Swiss-Italian Fossati brothers undertake a restoration under Sultan Abdulmecid I, sketching the uncovered mosaics and stabilizing the dome's cracks with metal ties and mortar injections. Their published album in 1852, full of measured drawings and romanticized images, introduces a new generation to the old empire's masterpiece. When the building becomes a museum, in 1935, the mosaics breathe again. When it reverts to a mosque in 2020, conservation protocols continue. A building that has played cathedral, mosque, museum, and mosque again remains a mosque again, remains a masterclass in structural longevity and cultural negotiation. Historians tend to caution against romanticizing. The caution is warranted. The empire has bad years, ugly politics, and budgets that wobble. Fires ripple through wooden-roofed neighborhoods. Earthquakes keep resetting the calendar. Yet the architectural record reads like a victory playlist. It's not just that the buildings are beautiful, though they are. It's that they are specific solutions to hard problems, dressed in gold and geometry. A dome that floats is also a dome that deflects, thrust into a pier. A wall that looks solid is a composite shock absorber. A cistern that glows in torchlight is a municipal reservoir that keeps bread baking. The longevity data points tell their own jokes. The Theodosian walls stand for over a millennium and only go down in 1453 under a barrage that would have turned Caesar's legions into abstract art. The basilica cistern holds water for 1,400 years and is still structurally sound enough to host art installations and tourist foot traffic. San Vitale celebrates 1,475 years, with mosaics that look fresher than last decade's wallpaper. The Chora's frescoes, painted over after 1511 and uncovered in the 20th century, flicker with color like they were finished last month. The Rotunda's dome at Thessaloniki rises through Roman pagan, Christian, and Ottoman phases. Catherine's monastery survives waves of conquest by being practical. Thick walls, treaties, terrain, and careful diplomacy. Longevity in this world is not magic. It's engineering plus luck, plus constant maintenance. Numbers sharpen the ore without killing it. Hagia Sophia's main space runs about 70 meters long and 30-something meters across at the nave. The central dome rises to 55.6 meters, The earlier dome collapse is recorded in 558. Repairs finish in 562. Later structural interventions show up in 989 and 1346. The Theodosian walls stretch approximately 5.7 kilometers. The inner wall thickens to about 5 meters. Towers number 96 along that line. The basilica cistern's 336 columns are not a symbolic number. They are what it took to hold up a brick-and-mortar lake. The Golden Horn chain spans roughly 750 meters. Heavy links are hauled by winches and anchors. Each figure tells the truth and carries a punchline. The ancients knew what they were doing. This is the secret shape of the Byzantine architectural genius. Bold where it counts, subtle where it matters, global before that word had a travel budget. Ideas move from Constantinople to Ravenna, to Venice, to Aachen, to Kiev and back. Techniques move across the Aegean and into the Balkans. Late-stage refinements adjust to new theological and economic climates. Light remains the constant obsession, whether in glass tesserae or pierced drums around domes. It is also the reason later empires orbit around a Byzantine precedence. The Ottoman skyline in Istanbul carries on the dome vocabulary with mathematical ambition. Western Europe, searching for a monumental church language after the Romanesque, picks up rib vaults and towers but still nods to the East in decorative programs and interior arrangement. Normans in Sicily make mashups that feel startling and coherent at the same time. The Orthodox world uses the cross in square as the friendly neighborhood church plan for centuries. Styles travel, structures persist. Nobody who actually walks through one of these spaces confuses the effect with mere decoration. The empire's architects understand the human body inside space. They place windows at eye level in galleries so the view across a nave has depth. They set thresholds at regular intervals to create rhythm. They use stairs as crescendo, not just vertical transit. Processions in the great church move from narthex to naive under a timeline of domes. In smaller churches, architects lower the ceiling to increase intimacy, then pop a dome to pull eyes up. Light cues manage mood, acoustics manage attention. The whole production is staged with the seriousness of a coronation and the playfulness of a mosaicist who can't resist a pattern. The myth of Byzantium as a museum of borrowed Roman tricks collapses under the weight of these specifics. The dome at Hagia Sophia is not a copy. It is a reimagining of Roman curved spaces turned into an Eastern Christian cosmic canopy. The Theodosian walls are not standard issue fortifications. They are a layered system that slaps siege warfare around for a millennium. The cisterns are not aqueduct leftovers. They are hydraulic strategy under a capital that expects to be tested. Middle Byzantine churches are not small. Hagia Sophia's. They are intentional, precise, modular plans tuned to ritual and acoustics. Late Byzantine brick and stone lace is not economy-grade Gothic. It is its own confident language. The ultimate flex is this. Many of these works survived, not because somebody wrapped them in velvet and put them on a shelf, but because later generations kept using them. Function preserved form. Hagia Sophia keeps its dome because imams and muftis keep it active. The Chora's lines stay because monks and then curators keep the walls upright. Mount Athos remains a living monastic environment. The Theodosian walls stand because city dwellers keep patching them generation after generation. Survival is an architectural choice, made over and over. Every dynasty reinterprets the city. Justinian builds big and fast, producing monuments that still shock. The Macedonians refine and export. The Komnenoi consolidate power and fold hospitals into churches. The Paleologoi curate and decorate, working with less cash and more finesse. The Ottomans pick up the dome and run it downfield. The modern city layers apartments and trams over ancient foundations, and still drinks water sent through Roman aqueducts, adapted in Byzantine, Ottoman, and Republican phases. A visitor can stand by the aqueduct of Valens, watch cars pass through its arches, then walk 10 minutes and stand under a dome that floats on 40 windows, set 1,489 years ago. The story doesn't slow down. It changes fonts. In a world that loves neat categories, Byzantine architecture refuses to cooperate. It is not purely Roman, purely Greek, or purely Christian. It is an ecosystem of structural intelligence and visual persuasion shaped by trade routes, theology, earthquakes, budgets, and ambition. It functions as propaganda and as public works. It handles imperial coronations and midnight floods. It absorbs losses and returns with edits. Its greatest hits live in Istanbul, Greece, Italy, the Balkans, and the Levant, like scattered tracks on a global playlist. This is why the dome of Hagia Sophia still feels like a mic drop. It says, in brick and light, that beauty and engineering are better together. It shows that a city can turn logistics into wonder. It proves that the medieval world did not forget how to build. It remembered how to build for a different world. The empire vanished in 1453, and yet its walls, cisterns, and domes keep working. That's a legacy. One can measure in meters, tons, decibels, and centuries. And inside the golden shimmer of a 6th century vault, the numbers still add up to awe. Banners fall, armies break, and out of the wreckage comes a dynasty that historians constantly call weak, while the receipts scream the opposite. The Song state rose in 960 and spent the next 3 centuries turning China into the richest commercial economy on earth. Not the flashiest in battlefield cosplay, sure, but in markets, money, machines, and mass production, the Song government moved with the energy of a startup and the paperwork of a Fortune 500. The chaos of the 10th century ended with a logistics empire in silk robes. The starting scene sits in 900, and the Tang collapse turned North China into a year-long sale on unwanted warlords. 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms sliced the land into pieces, and each piece taxed a different piece. Trade still ran, because merchants love a profit more than kings love borders. Then in 960, a career soldier named Zhao Kuang-yin pulled off the Chen Chao mutiny, took the dynasty starter kit, and rebranded himself Emperor Taizu. He unified core regions by 979. Not by razing everyone to the ground, but by cutting deals, buying loyalty, and demobilizing rival commanders. The military-heavy start calmed into a civilian revival. Scholars got the corner office, and the empire put its capital not in a mountain fortress, but in Kaifeng, a flat riverine city sitting on the Bian River and welded to the Grand Canal like a docking station. That capital choice says everything. Kaifeng was a port with a palace on top. Grain shipments from the Yangtze fed the city. Barges slid in, taxes were counted, coins were cast, and goods exploded from canal to street to shop. The Song state sought stability through supply chains. In 1984, the official Chow Weia introduced the pound lock on the Bian River, a water elevator for barges. Boats now climbed gradients without playing river roulette. That one infrastructural flex unlocked heavier cargo and higher volumes. The court handled governance like urban planning, plus industrial policy, centuries before those became buzzwords. Daily life in northern Song Kaifeng radiated energy. Night markets hummed under lantern light. The old Tang-era curfew system, with its closed wards and time-limited commerce, faded into irrelevance. Shops lined the streets. Restaurants and tea houses opened at all hours. Cooks slammed walks like percussionists. Fruit vendors shouted prices that would provoke a modern economist into applause. Court regulations tried to limit fires and crime, but city guards could not dam the flood of trade. A viewer only needs to roll through Zhang Zedouan's early 12th century painting along the river during the Qingming festival to feel the system. A long bridge bulges with pedestrians. A big cargo boat approaches the arch, while men on deck yank ropes to tilt the mast. Butchers hack, scribes copy, doctors examine pulses, entertainers perform, and porters weave through crowds with loads that would break a gym influencer. That painting is not fantasy. It is a street-level snapshot of an economy running hot. Big economies need people and food, and the Somme unlocked both. Population surged past 100 million by around 1100, a conservative estimate accepted by scholars like Patricia Ebry and Richard von Glan. The reasons were not mysterious. The court pushed agricultural expansion hard. Irrigation repairs rolled out across the empire. Oxen pulled iron ploughs more effectively than wood. Water wheels irrigated low fields. Hydraulic works old and new, like Dujiangyan in Sichuan and local dikes in the lower Yangtze, dialed up the water supply. The headline innovation arrived from the south coast of Vietnam. Champa rice. Around 1012, the court received a drought-resistant, fast-ripening rice as tribute. It was not just another cultivar. It allowed 2 harvests a year in many regions. Double cropping is a boring phrase for a civilization-level upgrade, because 2 harvests means more calories, more people, and more labor freed from the field for artisanal and commercial work. Yields rose. Famine still haunted bad years, but a larger base of production cushioned shocks. The lower Yangtze region became the kingdom of wet rice, and the empire's demographic center of gravity slid south. Now the myth. A supposedly traditional empire that frowned at commerce. The reality reads differently. The Song court taxed it, licensed it, regulated it, and absolutely used it. The empire's fiscal system rode on markets, not just land. Copper coinage poured out of the mints. While exact numbers vary by reign and source, there is no dispute about scale. The Song cast billions of bronze coins across the dynasty, with minting volumes in the 11th century dwarfing anything seen before in China. Cash coins stacked in warehouse towers, sacks of coins thudded on counters. Copper supply strained at times as coins flowed abroad, but the numbers still impress. And then the Song made a move that rewrote monetary history. The world's first government issued paper money entered the game. Private merchants in Sichuan had been issuing promissory notes, called jiaozi in the early 11th century, because moving iron or copper, cash over mountains, made strong men cry. In 1023, the state created the jiaozi office to regulate and issue those notes. The notes carried denominations in strings of cash called guan, with typical notes running from 1 to 10 guan, often expiring after 2 or 3 years, to keep circulation fresh. Convertibility was limited, and sometimes suspended during crises, because states like flexibility when water gets choppy. In the southern Song period, a broader line of paper currency called huizi launched in the 1160s for the lower Yangtze region. Shopkeepers used huizi daily. Tax offices accepted them for some payments. Inflation reared its head whenever officials treated the printing block like a miracle money tree. Still, the system worked well enough to keep markets moving. Paper money circulated alongside copper coins and, increasingly, silver. A multi-metal and paper monetary regime sounds messy. It was. It was also modern in its complexity and its reliance on credit. Debt and credit were not exotic. The state itself loaned money. One of the most controversial reformers in Chinese history, Wang Anshi pushed aggressive fiscal engineering between 1069 and 1085 under Emperor Shenzong. His new policies aimed to cut the middlemen out of local finance and give producers direct access to state-backed capital. The Green Sprouts program lent seeds and money at regulated interest to farmers, designed to stop rural usurers from swallowing villages after harvests failed. A tea and horse agency used state power to trade tea for war horses on the Tibetan border, turning a beloved daily beverage into a strategic procurement tool. State monopolies on salt and wine cranked out revenue. The Belgian system organized households into mutual responsibility groups for policing and tax collection. Sima Guan, the erudite historian famous for the Zhizhitongjian, hated it. Su Shi, the poet whose name gets attached to pork belly in restaurant menus, mocked the new policies and got exiled for his trouble. Song political culture thrived on memos, back and forths, and pointed poetry. The arguments were not academic. They were fights over how to finance the empire, and those fights shaped the economy's daily rhythm. Industrial output roared. Iron production hit a figure that raises eyebrows every time it appears on screen. For the year 1078, historian Robert Hartwell estimated Chinese iron output at roughly 125,000 metric tons. That number is debated, but even conservative reductions still put the Song well ahead of contemporary economies. The context matters. North China had deforested heavily by the 11th century, which could have choked smelting. Instead, iron masters turned to coal and coke. That energy pivot scaled furnaces and permitted a sustained output. Coal and iron fueled army gear, farming tools, household implements, and the sort of everyday metalware that feels invisible until it vanishes. For a sense of perspective, many European regions centuries later still ran on charcoal at volumes far below this. Technology did not sit still. In 1088, Shen Kuo described the magnetic compass and wrote casually about magnetic declination. He noted deficiencies in older astronomical instruments and proposed improvements. He was not writing a glossy tech brochure. He was a career official trying to solve practical problems. In 1119, the mariner and writer Zhu Yu described oceanic navigation that used a compass needle floating in a bowl, and he discussed ships divided by watertight bulkheads. Shipwreck archaeology later validated those bulkheads as Song-era design. Those design choices created a genuine blue water capability. The Southern Song made a permanent naval command in 1132 and turned the lower Yangtze into a school for shipbuilding. Paddle wheel warships spun against the current. At the Battle of Keishi in 1161, the Song Navy used trebuchets to lob gunpowder bombs against the Jin. That was not a fireworks show. It was a lethal proof of concept. The oldest known military formulas for gunpowder appear in the Wujing Zongyao, compiled around 1044. The formula details in that text do not play coy. Combined with the fire lance that evolved in the 12th century, the Song state had a real chemical edge. Printing took off with the same manic energy. Woodblock printing existed in the Tang, but the Song state made it a mass production beast. Official printing projects put the Confucian classics into crisp editions that prepped candidates for the civil service exams. Buddhist monasteries printed sutras on a scale that makes modern publishers look thrifty. Bai Sheng experimented with movable type around 1040, using fired clay pieces. Woodblocks, however, remained the efficient standard for large print runs. The point is not a technical field day. The point is information density. Shops sold exam primers, medical manuals, poetry anthologies, almanacs, and entertaining narratives. More books meant more literates. More literates meant a larger pool of exam candidates and clerks. The civil service exams became the mother of all national contests. In the 1070s, tens of thousands of men sat for exams, with only a few hundred winning the elite Jinshi degree. A pass rate around 1 or 2% meant exam pressure at merciless levels, and every printed page multiplied that pressure. This was credential capitalism in scholars' robes. Urbanization ran ahead of the state's capacity to regulate it, which makes a quick tour through Song city culture irresistible. Kaifeng, called Bianjing in official usage, probably housed close to or over 1 million people by the early 12th century, by many scholars' estimates. Nighttime commerce glowed under regulated oil lamps. Police patrols carried gongs. Fire brigades stood by with hooks and buckets, because dense wood and brick neighborhoods could turn into tinderboxes. The city had organized refuse collection and street cleaning. People bought skewers at midnight and listened to storytellers narrate dramatic episodes from history. They watched performances of Zaju plays. They bought printed calendars. They rented courtesans' company to talk poetry and politics, and sometimes more. The result was not debauchery. It was a layered urban culture that catered to literati taste, artisan production, and middle-class spending. Merchants did not hide in the corners. Corporate forms proliferated in everything but the name. Partnerships, called hakuo or gomshe, allowed investors to put in capital and share profits. In some cases, investors bought guffum or shares that could be transferred, a practice that Richard von Glan and others consider a kind of proto-equity. These were not modern corporations with securities regulators and tickers, but they created a flexible, scalable, commercial ecosystem. Brokers stood outside city granaries to line up shipments. Pawn shops multiplied because people like liquidity more than they like heirlooms. Official exchange shops handled tax payments and conversions. The state issued and sold salt certificates in the southern Song to raise cash now against revenue later, an instrument that reads like a government bond sold to merchants. The result closed a triangle. Merchants needed state guarantees, the state needed merchant capital, and both needed the transport grid. Transport formed the skeleton. The Grand Canal tied the Yangtze to North China. Rivers crisscrossed the central and eastern provinces, and officials dredged whenever silt tried to stall the system. Roads ran between local markets and prefectural capitals. Bridges popped up in stone and timber. The pound lock technology spread, making water transport drastically cheaper than carts, an argument that David Landis, Mark Elvin, and others have observed in comparing transport costs across pre-modern economies. Transport cost is destiny. The Somme made it low wherever water could do the work. Porcelain rode those waterways to global fame. Northern kilns like Dingware produced elegant, pale glazes with incised decoration. Rouen, with its legendary bluish crackle, enjoyed a brief, brilliant production run under imperial patronage that still makes collectors sweat. In the southern Song, Longquan kilns in Zhejiang turned out celadons in volumes that filled cargo holds. Jingdezhen, named after an imperial reign title in 1-4, evolved into the porcelain capital with Qingbaiware, a translucent, bluish glaze that still looks modern. Song ceramics did not chase gaudy. They chased perfect curves and quiet surfaces, and there were a lot of them. Shipwrecks in Southeast Asian waters commonly turn up with stacks of Song bowls and plates. Chinese coins turn up in those waters too, because Chinese copper cash worked as currency far beyond the empire's borders. The Bureau of Maritime Trade, established in major ports like Quanzhou and Guangzhou, taxed and organized sea commerce. Quanzhou became one of the biggest ports in the world by the 13th century. Merchants from Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and the rest of China, crowded the quays. The maritime tax take became a non-trivial percentage of state revenue, especially in the southern Song. Tea turned from a drink into an ecosystem. Monasteries planted and processed it. Whisked tea became a high art under the northern Song, with connoisseurs comparing froth and colour. The state taxed tea at multiple points and used its monopoly to leverage warhorse purchases on frontier markets. Salt, like tea, rested in a state monopoly that went back centuries but reached new heights under the Song because more people bought more salt for more food. These were not shy revenue practices. They were calibrated policies that met a market with a ledger. The myth of Song weakness sits mainly in its military record and the way the story ends. In 1-4, the Liao Empire forced the Song into the Chanyuan Treaty. The Song agreed to pay an annual tribute of silver and silk to keep the peace. Many commentators love to label that as weakness. In hard fiscal terms, it was a defense budget reallocated to bribe the neighbor with raw cash. The Song kept its core lands quiet and in exchange poured money into economy building. It was a cynical bargain. It worked until it did not. In 1125, 1127, the Jurchen Jin attacked. In a disaster called the Jinkang Incident, the invaders hauled off the Emperor Huizong, his successor Qinzong, and much of the northern Song court. Kaifeng fell. The north was gone. The state did not fold. The southern Song, reconstituted under Emperor Gaozong, retreated to safer terrain, and by 1138 declared Hangzhou, called Linen in official status, the capital. This looked like a mortal wound. It became a geographic pivot. The lower Yangtze and coastal provinces were already economically dominant. Now, the capital sat in the exact place where the empire's fastest-growing markets and fields lived. Hangzhou became the city that later writers described with awe. Marco Polo raved about it decades after the Song's fall, but native writers like Zhou and the author of Wulin Jushi made the place feel crowded, slippery with rain, and irresistible. Bridges arced over canals to reach streets stacked with theatres, tea shops, bookshops, garden estates, and more guild houses than any bureaucrat could count without a headache. If Kaifeng felt like a logistics hub wearing a crown, Hangzhou felt like Venice on rice and steroids. Southern Song fiscal policy ran in crisis mode. The Jin still bordered the state, and war cost money. The court sold salt certificates to merchants to finance the army. Paper money issues expanded, and with every expansion the risk of inflation grew. Economists would call this a floating peg with frequent interventions. People at the time called it daily life. Silver rose as the preferred medium for large transactions, even while copper cash dominated small trade. Tax rules got rewritten to allow more payments in money, which reduced grain-in-kind burdens and connected state finance to market rhythms. Breweries paid the wine monopoly. Salt dealers delivered the levy and got distribution rights. The Navy consumed massive resources, but paid for itself at times by stopping invasions. The Battle of Kaishi, already mentioned, did not just halt the Jin. It fortified the story of a water-based state holding its ground. More subtle changes threaded through daily life. Property law gave dowries legal traction inside marriages, granting women distinct claims that could be defended in court. That created bargaining power in households and in inheritance disputes. At the same time, foot-binding spread in the elites during the 12th and 13th centuries, a practice with complex social roots and absolutely painful consequences. It advertised status and control in an age of urban growth and female visibility in commerce. Song courts saw cases with women as litigants for their property, and Song streets saw women running stalls or small shops. The tension between legal rights and harmful fashion tells more about the intricacies of the economy than 1,000 moral lectures can capture. Money liberates and constrains at the same time. Science kept feeding the machine. Susong's clock tower in Kaifeng, completed around 1094, used a water-driven escapement mechanism and a chain drive to move an astronomical armillary sphere and a celestial globe. That device tracked celestial motion and told time with mechanical precision. It also screamed empire-wide skill. Metallurgy, gearing, casting, hydraulics, and mathematics. Paste all that onto a workforce of smiths and carpenters who stamped out boilers, war drums, and farm implements, and the output looks like a machine culture that had not heard about James Watt because it did not need to. Some mathematicians like Qin Jushao in the 13th century pushed polynomial mathematics and remainder theories. Yang Hui sketched a triangular array of coefficients, centuries before Pascal's name got stapled to it in Europe. These were not isolated scribblers. They wrote for an audience of officials, clerks, engineers, and students who had real problems to solve. Book culture exploded, with printing cheap and buyers everywhere. Publishers produced practical manuals, agricultural treatises, pharmacological catalogues, and encyclopedias multiplied. Shen Kuo wrote not only about compasses, but about geology, fossils, and optics. Commercial handbooks listed product prices and local specialties, a treasure map for wholesalers. Many texts were dry, and that dryness powered the economy. A merchant with a handbook could calculate profits and shipping times. An official with a table could assess a region's tax base. Knowledge circulated, and profits followed. The numbers remain the dean of the story. Over 100 million people by 1100. Iron output in 1078 in the 6-figure ton range. Call those the heavyweights. Now, add the budget. Richard von Glan estimates that government revenues by the early 12th century ran over 100 million strings of cash per year, with a string representing 1,000 copper coins. That figure varied with tax adjustments, monetization of corvée, and the mix of in-kind versus monetary payments. Not every string collected at the tax office stayed in one block ledger, since a lot of revenue effectively got pre-spent through monopolies and local expenditures. The point holds. The Song state ran the largest cash budget in the world at the time, even when tribute payments to the Liao and later the Jin bled funds, the internal economy could replenish them. Song commerce radiated outwards. Inscriptions and hoards of Song coins have been found in Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Ceramics turned up in Indian and Middle Eastern markets. Chinese ship design influenced regional standards. The compass, once a piece of tech that looked cute on a desk, steered multi-mast junks through the South China Sea's monsoon patterns with a precision that elongated the shipping season. The Bureau of Maritime Trade recorded cargoes, took taxes, and provided security. That security mattered. In a world without insurance companies, a state's ability to stop piracy functioned like a premium cut. Quanzhou's foreign merchant quarters expanded. Mosques and immigrant communities rooted themselves. Evidence that the Song was not only exporting goods, but also importing people and ideas. Artisans drove the system with obsessive optimization. Silk weaving specialized across regions. One region produced warp, another dyed, a third handled the high-end brocade finishing. Ironmongers standardized parts. Construction teams used modular timber brackets, called dugong, so buildings could be assembled and repaired quickly without long structural downtime. This modularity looked lovely in temples and profitable in warehouses. Standardized bricks, stamped with kiln marks, zipped along canals by the ton. Engineers deployed sluice gates and levees along the lower Yangtze's fickle waterways. And despite floods and occasional failures, The region's net arable land expanded. The Song government published river management handbooks because even hydraulic specialists couldn't memorize the rotating set of local disasters. The court kept more lists than a productivity guru. Registers tracked households for tax purposes. Tax categories classified land, mulberry trees, households, and potential corvée labor. Off and on, the state commuted corvée into cash payments, a shift that both boosted cash circulation and tempted officials into thinking money could solve any problem instantly. The exam system demanded literacy, which made local clans invest in schools. Private academies like the White Deer Grotto Academy trained students who later filled court ministries and put their names on policy battles. Great debates raged over the proper relation between state and market. Wang Anshi's partisans praised active policy. Sima Guang's circle feared disruption. The argument never ended because the economy never stopped changing. Part of that change involved ideological grit. Neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Xi did not sell books by promising economic growth. They tried to reconstruct moral life, yet their movement worked best in the Song's commercial world. Zhu Xi's commentaries on the classic standardized exam, interpretations, a godsend for test takers and a license for a print industry that could produce canonical versions quickly. His stress on family, discipline, and education fit with a world where hiring fired upward through the exam system. Moral philosophy and market reality linked arms even while disagreeing. A long look at steel and coal should not ignore the role of wood, paper, and clay. Consider the book trade. Paper quality mattered for brush writing and for printing clarity. Demand for high-quality paper stimulated specialized production of bamboo paper in Fujian and hemp-based paper elsewhere. Ink sticks became branded commodities. Think of artisan labels that guarantee darkness and texture. Bookshops needed shelves, cabinets, and hired scribes. Luxury buyers commissioned calligraphy. Mid-tier buyers bought printed anthologies. Small buyers rented or borrowed and shared. Libraries built by collectors turned into private institutions where culture and commerce played chess. The ripples from each book hit 100 shores. The Song economy looked like a set of nested markets. Village markets fed county seats. County seats fed prefectural hubs. Prefectural capitals fed the metropolises. Each level had officials, guilds, and middlemen. Tax collection and granary management followed the same nested structure. The ever-normal granary system tried to smooth price shocks by releasing grain when prices rose and buying when prices fell. A primitive but real stabilization policy. It did not always work, and local corruption sometimes turned famine into riot. But even failures taught officials to adjust. Over the 11th and 12th centuries, state capacity to monitor markets climbed, anchored by printed price bulletins and reports from the field. Counterweights existed. The empire's military ate revenue like a dragon. Northern Song standing army figures hit roughly 1 million by the early 11th century, with estimates around 1.2 million by the 1020s. Feeding, clothing, paying, and arming that many soldiers put severe pressure on the budget. Military colonies in the frontier took land and labor. The state's appetite for copper to mint coins meant more mining and more environmental pressures. Deforestation battered provinces even as coal use rose. The Southern Song's loss of northern resources in 1127 forced a reallocation of production southwards that could not match the North's mineral base. The system adapted by pivoting even harder into maritime trade and the lower Yangtze's agricultural surplus. But there was no free lunch. Diplomacy functioned as fiscal policy. The Chanyuan settlement with the Khitan Liao stabilized the north for a century. After 1127, an uneasy peace with the Jin bought time for the Southern Song to rebuild behind its rivers and canals. This acceptance of strategic defense aligned the budget with the economy's comparative advantage: water transport, navy-centered defense, and commerce. That choice ended in tragedy when the Mongols appeared. The Mongols methodically took down the Jin, then pointed themselves south. The Song allied with the Mongols against the Jin in the 1230s and helped destroy their old enemies. The cost of that alliance became clear when Kublai Khan's armies turned on the Song. The final act came in 1276 with the fall of Hangzhou, and in 1279 at Yemen, where the last Song loyalists went down fighting in a naval battle that ended with officials like Lu Xiufu choosing death rather than capture, dragging the boy emperor into the sea. Yet even that ending should not be read as a negation of the Song's economic story. The Mongol Yuan dynasty inherited a functioning market network, a maritime trade apparatus, and monetary experiments that it amplified and occasionally wrecked by overprinting. The lower Yangtze's rice paddies and porcelain kilns kept producing. The exam system paused and later returned, armed with the same canonical commentaries that Song culture had standardized. The global silver tsunami of the 16th century made Ming markets giddy, but the channels that swallowed that silver were engineered in the Song. The Song world broke myths as casually as it sold tea. Paper money did not appear with the Mongols. It was born under Northern Song supervision in 1023 and matured in Southern Song notes like Huizi. China did not play hermit while Europe invented commerce. In 1100 Song, China's cities rivaled or exceeded the urban giants of the Islamic world and dwarfed Europe's. Baghdad earlier had reached immense size. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Kaifan and later Hangzhou stood near the top in global urban population. Mass printing was not a late toy. It powered the book economy for centuries. Gunpowder did not stay in festival fireworks. It went to sea in bombs and into siege engines early, with clear documentation in mid-11th century military manuals. The Song military was not some parody of pacifism. It was a sprawling, expensive machine that made a strategic bet on rivers and canals instead of cavalry. Concerted skepticism always sounds wise. So here is the sober take. Scholars do not agree on every number. Hartwell's 125,000 ton figure for 1078 iron output remains contested, though even lower bounds keep the Song in the lead for its time. Urban population numbers rely on estimates and proxies. Fiscal totals shift as evidence is reinterpreted, with von Glan's research giving strong baselines for cash revenues, but leaving margins of error. Paper money circulation swung wildly, depending on region and year, and its purchasing power varied. All true. The macro pattern remains bulletproof. Between 960 and 1279, the Song state presided over a market economy with dense networks, complex finance, monumental urbanization, and technical sophistication at scale. That pattern can be seen one street at a time. In Kaifeng, the record Dongjing Meng Hua Lu, a memoir of Northern Song city life by Meng Yuan Lao, lists food stalls, street performances, and goods with a detail that reads like a Yelp list with better prose. In Hangzhou, the record Willing Jushi catalogues, lakeside pavilions, festivals, and shops with a glint that makes modern travel vlogs feel redundant. These sources do not romanticize scarcity. They document abundance. A citizen could sip tea brewed to whisked perfection, hire a scribe to draft a petition, buy a printed almanac, and ship goods down the canal using official brokers, all in one afternoon. The state enabled that afternoon with police, tax officers, bridges, and the monetization of corvée. Private capital enabled it with shops, partnerships, and credit slips. Manufacturing fits the same frame. Silk passed from silk farms to spinners to dyers to weavers, with each step taking place in different hands. Iron went from mine to foundry, to forge to market, with responsibility sliced into manageable units, prototype supply chain thinking. Porcelain's famous perfection came not from magic, but from skilled teams calibrating firing temperatures, combining kaolin clays and feldspathic materials, and carefully controlling oxygen levels in kilns. Mistakes became learning curves. Success became brand identity. The imperial court commissioned kilns to produce special wares, like official Guan ceramics, and collectors formed taste communities. Those tastes influenced prices and production. Cultural capital generated literal capital. Credit deserve one more spotlight. Merchants used stamped tallies, letters of payment, and partnership contracts that spelled out obligations. The legal culture of the Somme enforced contracts and recognized merchant associations, giving investors confidence. State documents in collections like the Somme Huiyao record bureaucratic mechanisms for managing finance and trade. Bureau of Exchange offices facilitated currency conversion and tax remittance across regions with differing coin quality and differing degrees of paper money penetration. Fiscal centralization and local initiative sometimes clashed. When things got hot, local officials improvised, often by copying what worked elsewhere and writing a memo later to justify it. Bureaucrats wrote memos as if their pensions depended on it. They often did. The exam system keeps returning to the frame because it created the empire's managerial class. Examinees drilled in the classics turned into administrators who could run a granary, oversee a ban on coin exports, or negotiate prices with canal contractors. In the 1190s, with copper outflows to Southeast Asia raising alarms, bans on coin exports were proclaimed and reprised. Enforcement was porous. Profits at sea tempted every sailor. Yet the state's response shows a keen instinct for macroeconomics. Coins leaving and silver arriving altered price ratios. Warnings issued at the time read like central bank minutes, lamenting capital flight. If politics makes the economic picture more dramatic, culture makes it luminous. Some painters like Fan Quan and Guo painted monumental landscapes that turned mountain and water into metaphysics. That style is more than aesthetic. It says something about how some people understood space. Landscapes show paths, bridges, huts, and travel. Trade is implied. Cityscapes capture the dizzy crush of market life. Calligraphers sold their brushwork in a market that judged line and energy with the same ferocity a modern collector applies to sneaker drops. Literati connoisseurship did not remove them from commerce. It placed them at the apex of it, as men whose taste set prices. Even the humble postal relay belongs here. The imperial courier system moved documents, not coffee. It linked provinces tightly to the capital, ensuring that reports on prices, harvests, and floods arrived fast enough for the state to respond. Communication costs shape empires. Lower communication costs improved tax collection, law enforcement, and the coordination needed to manage granaries and monopolies. The Somme got information loops down to a rhythm that earlier dynasties could only improvise. One final counter-myth should be pried out with a crowbar. The sharp economic take sometimes claims that Song China stalled because it did not industrialize in a European way. That argument commits an anachronism. In 1200, no one industrialized in a European way. The question is whether a pre-modern economy can reach complex, sustained commercialization across multiple sectors. The Somme did. The 11th and 12th centuries in China show a mature integration of agriculture, industry, finance, and governance. What stopped it from continuing into something recognizably modern involved geopolitics, the environmental limits of pre-fossil fuel growth, the chronic budgetary drain of a huge standing army, and a catastrophic external conquest by a mobile, well-led empire whose military model the song never matched. That does not erase the achievements. It contextualizes them. The song built a high-level equilibrium and rode it hard. Shen Kuo's notes on magnetic needles are often read in science histories as milestones. They are also business edges. With compasses, merchants pushed voyages earlier in the season and later in the season, which extended cash flow. Wu Jinzong Yao's gunpowder recipes appear in histories of warfare, but the economic story sits behind them. Nitrate production, saltpeter trade, transport priority for sulfur and charcoal, and small, specialized workshops producing hundreds of components. Susong's clock fits in technical histories. It also fits in regime legitimacy. A clock in the capital told the empire that the state ran on time. The final image of the song is therefore not an emperor. It is a map covered in fine lines. Each line marks a path. A barge route from Shaoxing to Hangzhou, a caravan from Sichuan over a mountain pass to the Chengdu Plain, a maritime leg from Quanzhou to Palembang, a silver flow from a mine to a market town where cloth is sold for coin, which is traded for salt certificates, which pay a tax which builds a bridge that cuts cart time by hours. On that map stand circles where markets flare every day. Temples, schools, and guild halls show social life pumping through. The state sits in the middle and takes a cut, bossing, cajoling, measuring, and often praying for the flood to be merciful. That is the Song economy in motion. Evidence backs the portrait. Historians like Patricia Ebry, Shiba Yoshinobu, and Valerie Hansen document the demographic juggernaut and urban detail. Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China catalogues the technology. Robert Hartwell's research sets the iron benchmark and the coal pivot. Richard von Glan's economic histories tie the currency systems and budgets into a coherent picture of monetization. Primary sources: the Wu Jing Zongyao, Shen Kuo's Dream Pool essays, Zhu Yu's Pingzhou Khitan. Court records compiled in works like the Song Hu Yao offer data points in the voices of bureaucrats and technicians who had skin in the game. The debate over exact numbers keeps the field alive, but the outline stands firm. An empire like that produces feeling as much as fact. The feeling is of speed, ships sliding off a slipway and into the canal, kilns glowing red and cooling to reveal a celadon that looks like thick water, night markets hustling under torchlight, a scholar reading by lamp, chasing a line of juicy commentary because the next exam opens a door with better pay, a clerk totaling strings of cash with a bone tally, while a merchant breathes down his neck, a commander listening to the beat of paddle wheels at night and hoping the trebuchet crew has enough gunpowder, a mother packing rice into a basket to sell at dawn because 2 harvests mean a little extra. This is not a fairy tale. It is the song. The legacy landed everywhere. Later Chinese dynasties adopted and amplified song tools. The exam system standardized texts. The maritime trade apparatus. The legal recognition of contracts. The art of measuring the economy with reports rather than guesses. When the Ming soaked up Spanish and Japanese silver, the Song's monetary and market habits gave those coins purpose. When the Qing built the most populous empire on earth, the Song's lower Yangtze irrigation and rice culture continued feeding the masses. When modern economists analyze pre-industrial market integration, they cite grain price series from the late imperial period because the Song began the work of knitting those markets together. Call the Song dynasty an economic powerhouse without flinching. The rise did not rely on a single miracle invention or one genius official. It came from compounding innovations. Champa rice accelerating agriculture, the pound lock cutting transport friction, coal firing blast furnaces, printing multiplying knowledge, exams manufacturing bureaucratic talent, paper money lubricating exchange, guilds organizing production, granaries stabilizing prices, ports anchoring oceanic trade, a navy defending rivers and coasts, and a court that, for all its mistakes, powered a system instead of smothering it. The empire lost the north, moved to the south, and somehow grew richer. It forged a template for a market-centered, imperial state that the world only later learned to recognize by other names. A last note lands with the most modern ring. Economies are stories told in numbers and in streets. The sum numbers are there. The streets were crowded. The dynasty fell because empires collide. The story of its rise still reads like a manual for turning fragmentation into prosperity. It starts with a general on a frosty morning, seizing a throne, and ends with a fleet on a foggy sea, going down beneath banner and smoke. In between, the markets kept ticking, the coins kept clinking, the notes kept circulating, and the people kept building. That is how a supposedly weak dynasty built the most advanced economy of its age, and left a blueprint that outlived its banners. Colonial officials insisted an African civilization could not have stacked the stones. The walls refused to respond. They had already been holding their own for 7 centuries without a drop of mortar, rising up to 11 meters high, with the kind of confidence that makes a tape measure nervous. Great Zimbabwe does not argue. It lets the granite do the talking. The setting is southeastern Zimbabwe, about 30 kilometers from the modern city of Masvingo, on a high plateau where granite outcrops push through red soils and thorny scrub. Here, across roughly 720 hectares, the ruins stretch in 3 clustered zones. A steep granite acropolis, known as the Hill Complex. A huge ellipse of coursed stone called the Great Enclosure. And a scatter of stone-walled compounds and hut foundations in the valley below. The place hums with absence. No mortar, no timber frames propping the walls. Just blocks split from local biotite granite and laid in tidy horizontal courses with subtle batter, wider at the base, narrowing toward the top, so the walls lean inward and hold. Nature provided a rock that flakes into brick-like slabs. The builders turned geological convenience into architectural flex. Archaeologists have a timeline. Occupation glows into view around the late 11th century, takes off in the 13th, peaks in the 14th, and wanes by the mid-15th. Radiocarbon dates and artifacts connect the site to Shona-speaking peoples of the Gokumer Leopards Kopje tradition, ancestors of many communities living across Zimbabwe today. The early stonework clusters on that hill. Later, during the 1200s and 1300s, the big statement piece appears downhill, the Great Enclosure. At peak density between about 1300 and 1450, the urban area likely sheltered 10,000 to 18,000 people. That is not a handful of huts. That is a medieval city by any standard, pulsing with cattle, gold, iron, sorghum, ceremonial processions, traders trekking in from the coast, and the quiet clink of imported glass beads. The architecture stays polite about its secrets, but it is not shy about beauty. Chevron bands ripple along some walls, triangles stacked into zigzags with fussy precision. Elsewhere, herringbone patterns flicker in the sunlight. The stones sit so neatly that small swifts still nest in the crevices, like they signed a tenancy agreement in 1325 and never felt the need to move. The walls do no heavy lifting in terms of roofing. People lived mostly in circular wattle and daub huts, with thatched tops, painted and replastered seasonally with polished dagger floors that shine under the right light. The stone itself frames power, enclosing courtyards, creating alleys, controlling access. The hill complex dominates the skyline, like a granite ship stranded at anchor. The earliest elite compound grew here. Later Shona oral traditions remember kings called Mambo. Portuguese visitors in the 1500s wrote about a northern successor state with rulers known as Queen Mutapa. The stone at Great Zimbabwe crystallizes an older phase of that political world. On the hill, platformed enclosures once held wooden buildings and sacred objects. Soapstone monoliths topped by zoomorphic carvings. Those famous birds stood here too. 8 birds survive from the site. Most are about 30 to 40 centimeters high, carved with hooked beaks, ringed eyes, and stylized plumage. They seem to merge bird shapes with human features, which makes sense in the ritual vocabulary of the region where animals mark lineages and connect to ancestry. The birds likely represent the hungwi, a fish eagle, associated with high-status families and rainmaking. They now sit in museums and official buildings, including one within the coat of arms of the modern Republic of Zimbabwe. One bird lugged off to Germany in the colonial era returned in 2003. An entire national mood, summarized in a single crate labeled fragile. Down in the valley sprawls the main city. The archaeology shows domestic yards crowded together, each centered on a hut or cluster of huts, with low stone walls demarcating space the way a modern city uses fences and hedges. Thousands of people lived here, working iron, tanning hides, brewing beer, grinding grain, tending goats and chickens, and keeping a serious number of cattle. Cattle meant wealth. Cattle meant marriage payments, feast power, and social gravity. Bones and manure. Traces point to corrals and kraals, and the whole settlement seems to follow patterns that Southern African archaeologists call the central cattle pattern. Cattle at the political and symbolic center. Elders around that. Elites closer, juniors further out. Thomas Huffman, a leading interpreter of the region's archaeology, reads the stone as mapping cosmology, gendered space, and ritual movement. His opponents argue for more flexible explanations. The walls do not cough up an instruction manual. They only demonstrate that someone planned this with intent and repetition. The great enclosure remains the showstopper. Imagine a sweeping ellipse of coursed granite that encloses an area so large that a modern visitor burns calories just walking the circumference. The curtain wall rises in places to about 11 meters, thick at the base, often more than 4 meters, and narrowing upward, the top serrated by carefully set capping stones. Inside stands the conical tower, a massive, solid buttress, about 9.1 meters high and roughly 5.5 meters across at the base. The tower contains no chambers. It is a solid statement. Theories bloom. A symbol of royal abundance, molded into the shape of a granary. A petrified horn. A marker of power in cattle societies. A metaphoric mountain inside a walled mountain. The archaeologists agree on one thing. It was not an accident. Nearby, a long parallel passage squeezes between 2 high walls. The passage narrows to less than 1 meter in places, forcing single-file movement and controlling how bodies and eyes flow through the space. Ceremonial choreography seems baked into the masonry. Everything here sits within networks, and the network story gets loud in the 13th and 14th centuries. One thread runs east to the Indian Ocean coast. There, at Sofala, Beira, Chibuuine, and further north at Kilwa Kisiwani, Swahili merchants created port cities built on coral rag and commerce. They sailed monsoon routes to Arabia, India, and in some seasons, as far as southern China. Archaeologists find imported beads in Great Zimbabwe by the tens of thousands, minuscule cylinders and ovals of glass made in South Asia and the Middle East and ferried ashore at East African ports. Shard counts typically resolve into clusters of Indo-Pacific beads that arrived via the Swahili coast. Celadon sherds from Lomquan Keens in Zhejiang province, China, appear in elite contexts at Great Zimbabwe, a green glaze that travelled more than 10,000 kilometres before meeting granite dust. The Celadon dates align with Yuan and early Ming production in the 13th to 15th centuries, which lines up neatly with the city's fluorescence. Kilwa minted copper coins under sultans such as Al-Hassan ibn Sulaiman in the early 1300s to grease these exchanges. The Portuguese later wrote that Sofala exported hundreds of kilograms of gold annually in the early 1500s. The interior supplied that metal. Gold dredges up the second thread, which runs to the geology underfoot. The Zimbabwe plateau holds auriferous quartz veins, and the rivers draining it carry alluvial gold that can be panned or trapped in simple sluices. People here worked gold well before Great Zimbabwe rose. They crushed ore with stone mortars, heated it in ceramic crucibles, and alloyed it with copper to make ornaments. The city functioned as a broker and clearinghouse for this wealth during its peak. Evidence of metalworking, lithic hammers, crucible fragments, slag turns up in the valley. Some researchers emphasize long-distance trade as the engine. Others, including Shadrach Chiricure and Innocent Pigurai, remind everyone that local and regional economies built resilience too. Iron hose, cattle, grain, cloth, and social ties fueled a platform that made long-distance trade possible, rather than the other way around. The archaeological record smiles and refuses to take sides. It only tells that gold, ivory, skins, and iron moved outward, while beads, ceramics, and prestige goods flowed in. The environmental setting did some heavy lifting for the rise. The plateau around Masvingo catches summer rains delivered by the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Average rainfall today sits around 600 to 800 millimeters a year, give or take the mood of the clouds. Paleoclimate proxies, pollen, charcoal particles, lake cores, suggest that the 1200s and early 1300s went through relatively wetter spells compared to the late 1400s. Wet decades boost sorghum and millet yield, grass for cattle, and the carrying capacity of the land. More grass, more hooves, more hoofs, more wealth, bigger walls. It reads like a simple loop, but the people who ran this city folded the loop into ritual, authority, and infrastructure. Construction methods reveal more intent than myth allows. The granite around Great Zimbabwe exfoliates naturally into layers, especially along joints weathered by thermal expansion and contraction. Quarry teams exploited that property by heating rock faces with fire and then dousing them to induce controlled cracking, or by striking along bedding planes with dolerite hammerstones. The result? Thousands of roughly rectangular blocks in various sizes. On site, masons sorted stones by thickness and length and laid them in shallow courses. Each course sits slightly inset from the one below, creating a gentle slope. The batter angle and the dynamic friction of rough stone let the walls stand without mortar. Some walls employ through stones, longer blocks that tie inner and outer faces together. Others depend on the sheer width of the base to resist lateral pressure. Maintenance would have been constant, a lesson in the hidden labor behind monuments. Someone recruited crews to carry, sort, set, and patch. That is logistics, leadership, and lunch support for hundreds of workers stretched across seasons. Decorative courses were not random. Chevron bands often sit near the top, at the most visible line from the ground. That takes planning because masons had to sort stone by color and size and maintain angle fidelity across long distances. The motifs tie into broader Southern African, symbolic repertoires. Triangles and zigzags appear on pottery and textiles as well. The effect in stone tilts from stately to flamboyant, depending on the wall. The great enclosure wall wears its chevron belt, like a tailored jacket, crisp and lean. Sections of the hill complex go full pattern party with stacked symbol layers. Elsewhere, undecorated stretches radiate austerity. The palette shifts because the builders leaned into the stone that lay at hand. Granite from one quarry just yields slightly darker blocks than another. The walls register those micro-local decisions, like a geological soundboard. The story of recognition takes a slower, messier path. Portuguese traders heard about the ruins by the early 1500s. In 1531, Vicente Pegado, captain of the Sofala fort, described the name Zimbabwe, a term he noted as a royal court. João de Barros wrote about a stone-built royal settlement in his Decades of Asia in the 1550s, reporting features that endure in travelers' accounts for centuries: stone walls without mortar, a tower, and a region tied to gold. Rulers in the 16th century sat north of Great Zimbabwe in a state that outsiders called Mono Motapa, derived from title Mwen Mutapa. Great Zimbabwe had lost top billing by then, but memory of a big stone capital persisted in the region's atlas of prestige. European colonial myths later kneecapped the truth and then congratulated themselves for the limp. In 1871, a German traveller named Karl Mosch reached the ruins and announced that he had found a link to King Solomon's mines and the Queen of Sheba. He compared the place to a biblical past he had brought with him, declared the wood he had seen to be cedar from Lebanon, and congratulated the Phoenicians for their achievement. The wood was local, the stonework was local, the theory was imported. James Theodore Bent staged excavations in 1891 with financing from Cecil Rhodes and similarly argued for a non-African origin. Richard Hall, installed as curator in 1902, cleared huge volumes of deposit in a kind of archaeological house cleaning that stripped out context and destroyed information. His crews hauled out pottery, beads, and other items and left the walls standing but the ground knowledge severely damaged. All of this served a colonial project that wanted Africa's most impressive ruins to be somebody else's story. The rebuttal came scientifically, and it came early. In 1905, 1906, David Randall McIver dug and found medieval African pottery in the relevant layers and concluded the builders were local Bantu-speaking peoples. He did not crack the prestige code of European audiences. In 1929, Gertrude Catton Thompson led a meticulous expedition with experienced excavators, including women trained on Egyptian sites, and pulled the plug on the myth further. Her team dug stratified trenches and found pottery, glass beads, iron objects, and domestic structures that matched a medieval time frame and a local material culture. Her conclusions were clear: African origin, medieval date. Some men in the empire disliked her tone. The evidence disliked their preferences. Later archaeologists, including Peter Garleg in the 1960s and 1970s, Thomas Huffman from the 1970s onward, Innocent Pikirai from the 1990s, and Shadrach Chiricure and colleagues more recently, layered radiocarbon dates artifact typologies, and spatial analysis on top. The pattern did not budge. Great Zimbabwe is African, Shona speaking in its cultural matrix, and medieval in date. UNESCO put the site on the World Heritage List in 1986, deploying a bureaucratic stamp of approval that doubled as a rebuke to a century of bad taste. So how did a city in the interior pull this off? It leaned on cattle and crops, yes, but it also plugged into a trade highway that ran to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Sofala, under Swahili control, was the choke point for gold export. Kilwa seized Sofala around the early 1300s to keep the gold tap under its thumb, a move recorded in the Kilwa Chronicle and corroborated by archaeology. Chinese celadon appears at Kilwa and at Great Zimbabwe in the same centuries. Arab and Persian glass vessels leave their glittering fingerprints on the coast and occasionally in the interior. Later Portuguese sources mention annual gold exports measured in hundreds of kilograms in the 1500s. And the interior polities that succeeded Great Zimbabwe certainly claimed control of reefs and streams where that gold sat. Exactly how much gold moved in the 1300s remains debated, but the flows were large enough to attract minting at coastal ports and envy from new arrivals steering caravels around Africa's capes. The site layout hints at a carefully maintained hierarchy. The hill complex holds the earliest stone, authority perched above in both literal and symbolic terms. Down in the valley, walls create a fractal sense of nested enclosures, each controlling who sees and who gets seen. Some enclosures contain raised platforms. In others, the walls shape partly hidden courtyards. The great enclosure includes that long, narrow passage which seems engineered for staging events. Different areas yield different trash. Elite zones produce more imported ceramics and ornate beads, along with better finished stonework. Commoner zones lean pragmatic with local pots, iron tools, and functional layouts. The aggregate reads as a city with clear social gradients and a taste for dramatizing power through space. The masonry structural logic has enjoyed decades of scrutiny. The Bata angle, often around 10 to 15 degrees, increases stability by shifting mass over the center line. Interlocking courses distribute load, and the rough surfaces of dressed granite increase friction between stones. Builders tweaked blocks with hammerstones to create tighter joints. Where walls run taller, internal features like filling and occasional internal buttresses add mass. Corners splay into curves to avoid stress concentrations. Modern civil engineers who walk the walls nod in respect. The masons understood what they were doing through experience rather than equations, a common fact in world architecture that academic textbooks finally acknowledge. Walkways built along the inside of some walls, supported by corbelling, let guards or ritual attendants move around the perimeter without stepping across domestic spaces. Even the placement of entrances reinforces the idea of control. Many openings dogleg before committing to the interior, forcing visitors to slow down and orient themselves rather than blitz into a courtyard like a toddler who just learned about sprinting. Ritual leaves subtler signatures. Soapstone birds' perches suggest symbolism saturated elite spaces. In Shona cosmology, ancestors mediate between the living and Wari, a high god. Birds, especially raptors, carry messages between worlds, much like they carry fish from lakes to treetops. Great Zimbabwe's leaders likely cast themselves as custodian intermediaries who organized rain rituals and harvest ceremonies, all while adjudicating disputes and banking cattle wealth. Rainmakers mattered on this plateau. Grain surpluses in good years permitted social investments and daring architecture. When rain wobbled, Authority had to perform convincingly. The stone helped, projecting order and permanence, even if drought bit into reality. The economy of making also matters. Iron smelting sites lie near the city, and those furnaces smoked with serious intent. Smelters fed charcoal into bloomery furnaces, layered iron ore, and drew out spongy blooms which they hammered into usable metal. Iron meant hoes, spears, knives, and ornaments. Specialized craftspeople worked copper and gold alloyed together into decorative forms. Potters turned out a lot of ceramics. Distinctive Great Zimbabwe pottery carries graphite burnish that gleams after firing, a signature look that archaeologists use to sort layers and phases. Textile production hums at the edges of the record. Spindle whorls show up in excavations, and cloth often appears in regional oral accounts as a marker of wealth. All of this runs on calories, which means sorghum, finger millet, cowpeas, and garden plots. Cattle added protein and milk and served as stores of wealth, with goat and sheep, flocks, rounding out the herd. The reach of Great Zimbabwe stretched across an uncertain but significant territory. Estimates vary, but influence likely ran across tens of thousands of square kilometers, from the high plateau down toward the lowveld and out toward the gold belt. Control would not have looked like airport-style security. It ran on kin networks, tributary arrangements, ritual obligations, and strategic marriages. When goods bottled up, someone sent messengers and then muscle. The city sits near important watersheds. The Mutirikwi River's valley lies to the north, and the broader Limpopo-Zambezi highlands spread around. These nodes offered staging points for caravans heading east. Decline arrives later, like a plot twist everyone saw coming, because environmental subplots kept dropping hints. By the late 1400s, multiple lines of evidence suggest drier conditions. Dendrochronology in some southern African regions points to drought cycles. Pollen records show shifts in vegetation. Charcoal layers stack up as people burned more fuel to cook, smelt, and clear land. Combine drought with deforestation and intense cattle grazing, and some soils tire quickly. Fields near the city degrade under pressure. Herds wear out grazing ranges and push toward the margins. Add political shifts. New stone capitals rise to the west and southwest, including Kami near modern Bulawayo, associated with the Torwa dynasty. To the north and northeast, the Mutapa state organizes power around goldfields that still run hot. Trade routes tilt toward those centers. The internal logic that made the great enclosure the center of gravity no longer holds. By around 1450, Great Zimbabwe slimmed down in population and political centrality. People moved, the way people always move, in response to drought, greener grass, and better job offers in neighboring chiefdoms. Even in decline, the walls persisted as a magnet for regional memory. The Portuguese who pushed inland in the 16th century heard of a place of stone associated with an earlier dynasty. They jotted down details. Antonio Fernandez trekked through in the 1510s, and his notes filtered back via João de Barros. Later, chroniclers like Antonio Boccaro and Father Gonçalo de Silveira wrote from within the Mutapa sphere. Their pages name rivers, goldfields, and kings, sketching a political landscape where big stone capitals punctuated a belt of power. Great Zimbabwe stands out in that geography as the earlier masterpiece. Professional archaeology turned the ruins into texts instead of trophies. The site plan separates into hill complex, great enclosure, and valley ruins as a modern heuristic, but continuous pathways tie them. Trenches cut by a century of researchers produce stratigraphic logs, complete with updated debates. Periodization, splits the site into roughly 3 dominant phases. Period I aligns with the late 11th to early 13th centuries, centered on the hill complex. Period 2, mid-13th to early 14th centuries, yields the construction of the Great Enclosure. Period 3, the 14th and 15th centuries, sees intensification in the valley, multiplication of smaller enclosures, and maximum population. Pottery styles transition across these phases. Bead assemblages shift in composition as sources on the coast turn over. Radiocarbon provides anchor points, but researchers emphasize that cross-checks with artifacts keep the dates honest. The tools of the trade changed over time as well. Early masonry uses chunkier blocks, later walls trimmed toward tighter courses. Some decorative motifs do not appear until the site reaches peak complexity, implying skilled guilds or master masons who passed down knowledge. The labor behind these walls demands either steady conscription or ritualized building seasons, both of which point to organized leadership, capable of mobilizing hundreds of people for weeks. Food, water, and coordination had to line up with construction cycles. Elite households would have hosted crew leaders, while line workers slept in temporary camps and chewed through supplies. This is project management that can teach modern spreadsheets a thing or two about resilience. Without Wi-Fi, myths linger because they delivered dopamine. The Queen of Sheba shows up in the Great Zimbabwe myth because biblical fan fiction sells, not because evidence demands it. Phoenicians appear in early theories because 19th century Europeans could imagine sailors crossing oceans before they could imagine Africans organizing labor. James Theodore Bent harvested suggestive coincidences and ignored straightforward facts. The soapstone birds became evidence of non-African finesse until Catton Thompson dug them out of strictly African strata and compared pottery to known regional sequences. Peter Garlick took brick-by-brick measurements in the 1960s and 1970s and mapped decorative patterns in situ, finding nothing that required an import license from Tyre. Now, when someone free associates Great Zimbabwe with Solomon's Mines, historians respond with a patient smile and a stack of peer-reviewed articles about Longquan Celadon and Shona ceramics. The stones did not change. The scholarship did. The modern nation traces its name to this city. Zimbabwe derives from Shona phrases, often rendered as Zimba, Ba, houses of stone. The plural matters. This is not a single palace, but a dense set of complexes. The state flag centers a stylized bird taken from the soapstone sculptures. That icon traveled across centuries, through colonial appropriation, into a museum case, then into a national coat of arms. When the bird returned from Berlin in 2003, the handoff carried more than a modest plinth. It carried a pivot in storytelling about ownership and genius. Local communities have long known that their ancestors stacked the stones. School curriculums and tourism did the rest. The site today navigates preservation against foot traffic and vegetation growth. Granite expands and contracts with heat. Tree roots pry at joints, the way tree roots always do. Rains carve gullies around foundations. Conservators patch with care, which means respecting the physics of dry stone construction and the visual language of the original courses. The goal is not to rebuild a lost city. The goal is to keep the visible one upright and comprehensible. That is harder than it sounds. Uncontrolled restoration can erase the very tool marks that teach the past. The best crews work like whisperers, nudging stones back into stable alignments, rather than forcing new ones into old gaps. UNESCO listing in 1986 brought attention and resources. It also brought weekend crowds with selfie sticks. The guidebooks now mention early archaeologists by name: Caton Thompson, Randall Mathive, Garleg, as part of the site's layered biography. The intellectual afterlife of Great Zimbabwe extends beyond the valley. The site anchors a culture area archaeologists call the Zimbabwe tradition, marked by dry stone masonry capitals in Zimbabwe and adjacent regions. Kami to the west, Nalatale and Danangombe further afield, Dulolo and Maniakeni in neighboring territories. Each has its own stone vocabulary, but shares familial grammar. The tradition blends sacred leadership, cattle wealth, and long-distance trade into governmental structures that predate European arrival by centuries. These places converse across time through their stones. Great Zimbabwe speaks the loudest because it grew the largest, but the conversation does not end at its walls. The craft of reading this city continues to evolve. Huffman's structuralist readings, male and female spaces, initiation journeys mapped onto architecture, ritual funnels hidden in passages, sparked productive debate. Critics point out that rigid structural templates can iron out the wrinkles of real human lives. Chirikura's team emphasizes craft economies and everyday resilience, highlighting how diverse livelihoods coexist under a political canopy. Pikirai threads archaeology with oral histories and early written sources. Careful to keep the categories honest, the synthesis holds a steady center. Great Zimbabwe grew out of local culture, excelled in engineering and social organization, and sat astride regional and global trade networks that brought Longquan Celadon bowls to a granite valley 30 kilometers from Masvingo. The money story offers its own grounded lesson. Gold made strangers pay attention. Cattle made households stable. Iron hose turned soils. Glass beads framed status. A city thrives on layered economies where a bad season in one sector can be cushioned by another. That pattern repeats across African history, and Great Zimbabwe writes it on the land in stone and soil. When drought-blasted fields, herders shifted herds. When coastal trade patterns changed, some elites migrated to new capitals like Kami, while others recalibrated closer to home. The decline of the stone city does not read like collapse. It reads like reorganization under pressure, with people dragging their households and their knowledge into new arrangements. Of course, the drama of stone still grabs attention. Guidebook pages list the height and the conical tower measurements like baseball stats. The conical tower stands at roughly 9.1 meters, an absurd surplus of purpose if its job is only to look impressive, which is admittedly an excellent job for a tower. The great enclosure walls soar to 11 meters, the highest in sub-Saharan Africa before modern times, for freestanding dry masonry. The combined length of walls across the site runs for several kilometers, a local record that might seem modest until one tries to move a few tons of granite by hand in summer heat. The total footprint covers about 720 hectares, a metric that puts the site on lists where Angkor and Tikal loiter with smugness. That kind of scale changes how textbooks sound. The stones render a particular kind of myth obsolete. The myth of singular African villages, frozen in time until a European ship anchored offshore and showed everyone the magic of cities. Even the quiet details carry charge. Some valley walls curve with a grace that suggests a mason's hand practiced over decades. Some stones bear tiny peck marks where a hammerstone corrected a wobble. Pebbles embedded in old plaster floors glint where foot traffic polished them. A test pit reveals a layer of ash from a cooking hearth used for a handful of seasons in the 14th century, then covered over with new plaster and forgotten. A bead, no larger than a popped sesame seed, slips from a sieve and lands in a bag, labeled with a locus code. Each speck tallies into the larger voltage of the place. It becomes impossible to sustain the idea that complexity requires an imported blueprint. The blueprint lies underfoot and in the hands that worked the debris into order. Every big ruin invites an origin myth that flatters the current storyteller. Great Zimbabwe got absorbed into a line that now includes modern memes about ancient aliens. The Wall laughs all of that off. Dry stone engineering does not need aliens. It needs experience, time, and a patient backlog of labor. Chamfering a block into a better fit may not trend on social media, but multiply the gesture by 1 million and a city emerges. The locals did not write treatises on thrust and friction. They built like they meant to live here and let the results be their dissertation. Historians such as David Beach and archaeology teams across the last half-century excavate the evidence and annotate it with responsible caution. Misattribution fades when measurable facts pile up. For those measuring, the numbers get blissfully specific. Pottery sequences tie around rim shapes and graphite burnish zones that cluster into named types. Bead types pigeonhole into Zizo, K2, and other series with different chemistries tied to specific production centers and dates. Radiocarbon dates cluster around the 13th to 15th centuries for intensive occupation, spiking in contexts linked to elite compounds. Iron slag heaps weigh literally tons, evidence of neighborhood-scale metallurgy. Woodland charcoal shows species shifts through time, as high-demand hardwoods give way to more readily available shrubs. All that sits in arc-shaped distribution maps that turn the city into a spreadsheet with a skyline. The hill complex still anchors origin stories for the settlement. Early enclosures align with positions on bedrock platforms, implying a staged expansion. The simple becomes ornate. Stone fences become complex walkways. Platform structures evolve from practical to performative. Significantly, soapstone birds cluster up here, and the hill likely hosted the most restricted ritual spaces. The city then reproduced a version of that order below, when the great enclosure rose. An echo or response visible from the hilltop, like a dialogue between elders and new elites mediated entirely in granite. That dynamic between old and new elites may explain some of the spatial quirks. The great enclosure sits separate from the hill, asserting independence, yet remaining in view. The conical tower stands where it cannot avoid being noticed. The passage squeezes bodies into lines and sequences. Ceremonies enacted in this space would have broadcast messages about who controls access to ritual, who commands bestowal of wives and cattle, and who dispenses justice. The built landscape becomes a constitutional document, and like many constitutions, it makes people walk the long way around, because symbolism beats convenience in a monarchy every day of the week. Debates over what exactly the great enclosure hosted get lively. Some argue for initiation rites for young women, key to Huffman's readings of spatial gendering. Others emphasize feasting and diplomatic reception. The archaeological distribution of pots, charcoal, and animal bones inside the enclosure speaks of temporary activities rather than long-term residence. Whatever the specific script, the space reads as a stage more than a living room. That distinction matters when imagining the city as a political theater. No sound system, no lights, just stone that amplifies footsteps and narrows a visitor's field of view until a new angle opens in front of something deliberately imposing. Trade goods may have sparkled during such audiences. A celadon plate catches sun at a slant and winks. Glass beads threaded onto fiber cord weigh mere grams, but anchor relationships that stretch to merchants in Cambay or Aden and makers in Jeong kilns. Ivory and gold promise intangible luxuries in distant markets. Perfumed rooms, twisted metalwork, coins that pass through 10 hands in a bazaar before returning as something else entirely. The layered geographies of the object, filigree, wrap around the granite architecture like a mesh of connections no single wall could hold. The city became a node by turning that mesh into ritual, status, and rules. Status and rules. Rules included how to dispose of trash. And trash is where archaeologists feast. Middens slice clean through time. One trench reveals a series of alternating layers. Crushed pottery, ash, bone, ash, broken bead fragments, ash. Each layer marks a cycle of feasting and cleaning. Another trench near the walls shows a fine red floor laid over older floors. Each square meter polished by domestic life. That doubling and tripling of floors tells a story of occupancy, dense enough that each generation refreshed its surfaces rather than moving house. In some elite areas, floors appear thicker and more carefully maintained. Everywhere, the absence of mortar remains theatrical. It is a brand identity here. Brand reputation does not always protect against vandalism. Colonial restoration in the early 20th century shaved off deposits, reset stones with the wrong profile, and imposed tidy lines where ruin had broken them. Later teams untangled what they could and documented fractures that cannot be unbroken. The site today carries those scars. Interpretation requires careful distinction between original courses and modern repairs. Guides walk visitors through that without making the experience a lecture on trauma. Still, a measurable percentage of the site's archaeological richness disappeared to pickaxes wielded by men intent on proving a theory. That is the kind of lesson a ruin should not have to teach twice. Across the region, other stone capitals join the chorus. Kami developed after Great Zimbabwe's decline, with walls more often built with dolerite rubble, core, and finer facings. Its terraces step down a slope with decorated retaining walls that feature checkerboard and chord patterns. Nalatail's motifs run flamboyant, a stone embroidery that announces artistry as much as power. At Danangambi, the plan echoes Great Zimbabwe's in miniature. All these sites share an intellectual kinship, a political habitus that turns stone into a social diagram. No alien help, no biblical cameo, just centuries of refined practice, evolving as kingdoms rose, fell, and swapped capitals like fashion houses changing addresses in Paris. Modern scholarship anchors the narrative in the steady hum of data. Gertrude Catton Thompson's 1931 book, The Zimbabwe Culture, set a research agenda that later colleagues expanded. Peter Garleg's field drawings and measurements fixed the architecture on paper in the late 20th century. Thomas Huffman's interpretive frameworks sharpened the debate and still spark footnotes. Innocent Pikurai's synthesis in the Zimbabwe Culture, Origins and Decline, 2001, threaded environmental and political change into a cohesive story. Shadrach Chiricure and collaborators used archaeometry to study beads, ceramics, and metals, undercutting the idea that long-distance trade alone powered development. Regional historical linguists mapped Shona place names and titles to historical polities. Portuguese chronicles, Barros, Bacaro, Pegado, provide only external references, unreliable in detail but invaluable in contour. The combined archive is robust. It can carry the weight of a viral theory without collapsing. Back on the ground, a visitor can stand in the great enclosure and track the sun as it slides across the inner face of the wall, light scraping across stone like a hand on rough cloth. A breeze slips down the parallel passage and cools the space. Birds cut small shadows across the sky. A goat bleats somewhere off-screen. The noise floor reads ancient, but the moment is present. The walls play tricks with acoustics. Footsteps are damped, then amplified. then damped again. It would have been easy to control how a procession sounded here, just by staggering where people walked. A leader standing by the conical tower could listen to power physically rebound from stone. Humans have always been fond of that effect. The politics of reclaiming this past, played out not only in academic journals, but also in classrooms and on national holidays. Choosing the name Zimbabwe in 1980 was not simply about avoiding colonial baggage. It was a direct assertion that modern sovereignty grows out of long-standing statecraft and engineering on this plateau. The soapstone bird pivoted from artifact to emblem. Its hooked beak points into the near future on flags and courtrooms. That is not kitsch. That is architecture talking across time. A conversation about endurance and skill conducted by a block of stone, given a distinctive curve and a pair of eyes. None of this diminishes the endurance of mystery. The conical tower's function remains officially unknown. The precise sequences of some walls remain contested. The scale of gold flows in the 1300s, sits under a cloud of estimates. The shifting boundaries of influence across the region leave tidy maps guessing. Yet even the open questions feel grounded. This is not speculation built on fantasy. This is conjecture built on trenches, sherds, and walls. It is the difference between citing a Victorian traveller's hunch and citing a radiocarbon date from a charcoal lens, sitting under a polished floor, sealed by another floor above it. The importance of cattle still grazes across the landscape. Ethnographic parallels, bone assemblages, and kraal layouts show how the animal economy underwrote the political economy. Cattle-mediated marriage bound families across distance and made festivals big. Herds translated rainfall into social capital. When rains failed and grasses crisped, herds moved and politics moved with them. Change in the 1400s likely compressed options for elites based at Great Zimbabwe. Kami and Mutapa stepped into the vacuum, not as aliens, but as siblings. Stone can be heavy and permanent. Power can be light and mobile. The city is where those fall, in and out of alignment. Evidence of metalwork stays persuasive. The slag heaps are not enormous by modern standards, but they are more than hobby scale. A consistent suite of iron-tipped tools, copper ornaments, and even gold wire points to specialized crafters linked to households of rank. Artisans likely worked close to elites and supplied them with prestige goods to deploy in diplomacy and ritual. The presence of imported luxury ceramics in elite courtyards indicates a taste for foreign objects that track exactly with elite taste everywhere at all times. A green bowl from Longquan still looks good on a polished red floor. The ancient Instagram of status objects works without Wi-Fi. The craft of masonry deserves a final bit of ore. Dry stone walls this high do not forgive hurried hands. The joint-finding skill set takes years to attain. Apprentices would have learned to spot which block fits where by eye, a Tetris-level cognition that only comes with thousands of attempts. Behind every true wall lies a pile of rejects. The yard near a build site would have rattled with tapping as workers shaped blocks into slightly better fits by taking off a millimeter here, a wedge there. Some of those working faces remain on blocks still visible today, a pecked texture like stippling on a print. The wall records individual decisions about which block to pick into something that reads as a single gesture across hundreds of meters. That is art. There is an irony in dry stone that anyone who has stacked a garden wall understands. The tighter the run, the more the wall breathes. Mortar would have locked these stones into a brittle frame. Without it, the wall tolerates minute shifts, heat, and the occasional root intrusion. The builders did not reach for mortar because they did not need it, and because they understood their material. That represents a bias toward workability over overbuilding, a modern lesson hidden in granite. Strong enough is strong enough. The rest of the strength belongs in where the wall stands, what it marks, and how people move around it. Modern conservation borrows those old insights. Crews use lime-based mixes sparingly and avoid gluing stones into unnatural alignments. A tree shading a wall gets cut back not for the view, but to prevent roots from playing amateur engineering. Paths get routed so thousands of feet march where the wall can handle the vibration. Stories get told with disclaimers. Nothing here is reenacted with props. The drama is in the stone, not in costumed docents inventing dialogue. Real history delivers its own adrenaline when the details land right. The details have landed. Great Zimbabwe's rise ran from around 1100 into the 1300s and 1400s, with walls that climbed to 11 meters, a conical tower at 9.1 meters, and a city footprint that sprawls over roughly 720 hectares. A population of perhaps 10,000 to 18,000 clustered in the valley under a hilltop elite who managed cattle, gold, and rituals. Imported beads and Chinese celadon shirts testified to an Indian Ocean trade that connected this granite valley to mariners timing their sails to monsoon winds. Portuguese chronicles noticed the aftermath of this era in the 1500s, writing down titles and rumors. Colonial mythmakers tried to outsource the credit. Gertrude Catton Thompson and a century of archaeologists repossessed it with trowels and stratigraphy. The walls keep standing, unbothered by all of it. Every ruin worth the pilgrimage extracts a promise. This one asks for the kind of attention that slows down the eyes. Chevron bands turned out by patient hands deserve that. Soapstone birds that became national emblems deserve that. A city that unmakes a toxic myth deserves that. The humor lies in how uncomplicated the correction ultimately feels. Shona masons stacked granite. Shona rulers organized labor and ritual. Shona traders funneled gold to Swahili merchants who shipped it across the world. The place looks miraculous because it is assembled from thousands of ordinary acts done well. That is how most miracles actually happen. The last frame belongs to the stone again. Sun warms the granite. Wind threads the passage. A lizard flicks across a capstone and vanishes. The wall bears small scars, where later hands tried to impose themselves, but it holds. It does not explain itself. It does not apologize for being big, local, and brilliant. Great Zimbabwe is the kind of place that teaches with presence. It rose because people here got very good at building, organizing, and connecting. It kept its hold on landscapes and imaginations because it tells that truth in granite. The argument is over. The walls won.